Number 13 work session of the Ann Arbor City Council. First off, I would like earnestly to apologize for the late start. I strive to start these things on time. Kid transport issues, but my earnest apologies. It is disrespectful of me to start the meetings other than at 7 o'clock when you all are here prior to that, so I'm sorry. So we have a work session tonight, of course, to discuss the City of Ann Arbor Community Policing Commission. We'll be having a presentation from Mr. Lazarus, our city administrator. And there will be some questions, I suspect, from the council. Then thereafter, we'll have a presentation from members of the task force, and then there will be, I suspect, some questions from council. At that time, after both those presentations and question sessions are done, there will be opportunity for public comment. The public comment will run until folks are done commenting, just so that folks understand how that tends to work. And I'll repeat these rules when the time comes. Speakers at public comment will have 3 minutes in which to speak, we'll sit and be here and talk and listen until people who have spoken wish to speak. Councilmember Kalasapathy.
Mr. Mayor, I would like to amend the agenda, and I would like to ask you and council to allow the police task force members to do their presentation first, because after all, Mr. Lazarus's response is a response to what they have produced. So I think it would be better to have their presentation first and then have Mr. Lazarus's response thereafter.
Councilmember Bannister.
I second that motion.
Seconding that.
Discussion. Councilmember Lum.
Hi, we have received a lot of emails from folks asking what Councilmember Kalasapathy just requested. And I know, we all recognize the task force put a lot of effort into this. There is an opportunity, though, this is a work session, but for public comment. But I guess is the expectation then that the city administrator's presentation is to be a reaction to the task force's ordinance and recommendations, suite of recommendations, versus him walking through what has been presented us thus far by both the task force and himself? I don't know, that's... I'm open to what my colleagues prefer here, obviously. It's not a big deal, I guess.
If I may.
Mr. Eaton.
I've seen the city administrator's presentation, and it does seem to be a reaction to the presentation of the task force. But that was to the task force, and they were all very well aware of the work that they had put into this over the last 4 months. And so, for the benefit of those of us who haven't been watching these meetings or attending them, and those in the room, I think it would be quite useful if the task force representatives were allowed to explain the work that they've done over the last few months before we hear the recommendations of the city administrator, which are really a response to those recommendations.
Further discussion? Any solid objections? Let's, are there visual aids on the task force side?
Only ourselves.
All right, fair enough. Well, then let's roll with that.
Are there time parameters?
My name is Dwight Wilson. I'm a member of the Human Rights Commission, and I'm also in the task force, and happy for this opportunity. Love and compassion compel me to stand before you. They are not the opposite of law and order, but when they do not form the foundation of a society, their absence equals oppression. Few African American men escape police-induced post-traumatic stress. Regardless of gender, to be a person of color older than adolescence in our society is to know someone who has been killed, brutalized, or humiliated by law officers. It is also to have been racially profiled multiple times by our employees in uniform and our neighbors in street clothes who hatefully point out our mere innocent presence to law officers. After making such a statement, you are correct to assume Black Lives Matter is a part of my DNA. You, a forward-thinking city council, empowered our task force to establish a police oversight commission. Accepting our civic duty this summer in good faith, the task force members and the community collectively devoted thousands of hours interviewing with open hearts, painstakingly researching policy, oversight practices, and experiences to discern the best, discussing and sometimes debating, thoroughly writing multiple drafts, and inclusively vetting an ordinance. Perhaps I had more incentive than others. African American, grandfather of 3, father of 4, brother of 5, patriarch of hundreds, friend of thousands, servant leader, committed to building a better community for all people. But look at you. You represent tens of thousands, and today you stand at a crossroads where you can choose a continuation of a non-inclusive, non-transparent, deeply flawed status quo, or a glimpse at what justice looks like. You can make your legacy the building of something worthy of exporting to communities of millions whose jungles are concrete and peace is found only in death. Will you choose melancholy mediocrity, or will you dare to be great? I will be watching with skin in the game, interested to see if in the age of hate-filled tweets and open advocating of building racial walls, your actions favor the democratic process, checks and balances, love, and compassion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Monica Harold, and I want to thank you for this opportunity to share with you. I'm speaking as part of the task force, but also as an individual member of the Ann Arbor community. In January, I received a copy of an invitation from the Human Rights Commission in which it welcomed applicants to serve on a task force charged with developing a charter for a community-based committee focused on improving and strengthening police-community relations, civilian review of police complaints, identifying resources to support this committee, and other issues related to policing in Ann Arbor. With that in mind, I applied and was chosen to be on the task force. Many people have and will speak to the time spent to create the document that this is all in response to, and that we created in response to that invitation from the Human Rights Commission. I was unable to attend the meeting last Thursday due to personal family matters, but I was literally stunned by the information I received that delineated the city administrator's response to our work and his recommendations for a police oversight committee. What I read seemed to cast aside all the work of the task force and creates a commission that is, in essence, created by the city attorney and the city manager and serve as an arm of the Ann Arbor Police Department. Specifically, while I fully expected there would be some changes proposed, I did not expect a plan wherein the city administrator would be the one to propose the process for recruiting commission members and creating the schedule for forming the commission. The city administrator and the city police chief would provide the scope of training for the commission. That the city administrator would ensure, quote, appropriate Ann Arbor Police Department participation in commission proceedings, wherein the commission would receive complaints and forward them to the Ann Arbor Police Department for investigation and resolution. A plan wherein the commission's reports about the Ann Arbor Police Department's resolutions of complaints and investigations will be advisory and not binding on the city. I did not expect a plan where the city administrator will ensure the commission's access to information and resources necessary to perform review. I did not expect a plan in which the commission will review recurring reports on Ann Arbor Police Department activities from the chief based on information that is available or can be reasonably provided. If these items alone, never mind the many other suggestions that were made, are enacted, the commission becomes nothing more than an arm of the police department, a figurehead entity giving them attaboys when their report align with what they have been trained by the police to expect. While I can honestly say that I do not agree with the heavy anti-police stand that some have expressed, neither do I agree that this commission that is supposed to be created to improve community police relations, provide review of complaints, and identify supporting resources, this commission should not become something that is a police oversight commission in name only. While the city administrator certainly has a right to share his ideas, as my granddaughter used to say when she was 3 years old, those are his ideas. But I ask that you take a serious look at the work of the task force. We need this commission. Contrary to many, I believe it should be an independent, impartial entity with the power to examine reported incidents, follow the facts wherever they lead, and provide the appropriate redress and support to all involved parties. I ask that you listen to what my fellow members have to say tonight, and that you will take a serious look at our work, and if necessary, work to make changes, and that you will support a commission that will do the work it was created to do. These are my thoughts.
Thank you.
My name is Dick Sobel, and I am a member of the task force. I think there's been widespread acknowledgement by everybody on this council of the role that the Human Rights Commission had in establishing this process for the commission. One of the main reasons that the HRC recommended citizen involvement in identifying and examining and addressing concerns about Ann Arbor law enforcement was a breakdown in trust. And that was one of the main reasons that they pushed that, is that they felt there was a breakdown in trust. They wrote to you in their 11/4/15 report, trust is uneven in our city. Some people feel less safe than others, and a disconnect exists between the police and some groups in the community. Oversight of law enforcement, citizen oversight of law enforcement, would serve to strengthen trust in the police throughout the community. It is with that in mind that the task force undertook its work. The task force said, we will set up a procedure where the commission will receive and investigate complaints consistent with state law, the charter, and the CBA, collective bargaining agreement. And we took that into account in our investigation sections that you see there. We'll take that into account. The city administrator said, no, you will not receive and investigate. You will only receive and refer. And so there will be no opportunity under the city manager's approach for the commission to do any independent investigation, even though the results of that investigation are not binding on the city, the police officer, or anybody else. It is as if the police department does not want an independent, or the city manager does not want an independent investigation with all the protections that we built into that investigative process. The task force said we need independent counsel. The city administrator said no. You do not need independent counsel. He says in the report that task force will be provided a staff person from the city attorney's office who will give you whatever advice and counsel that you need. Task force said, we are not comfortable at all with receiving advice from the city attorney who represents the Ann Arbor Police Department and us if there's a dispute. We said, if there's going to be judgment that's going to be respected, legal judgment that's going to be respected by the community and council, we need to have an independent counsel. That's not to say that the city attorney or anybody in their office is incompetent or anything else. They are like anybody else that has a conflict of interest, and we shouldn't institute a conflict of interest by starting off this commission. We have youth. We have a youth representative that served in the task force as a voting member. City manager says we don't want a voting member as a youth. The youth will be a non-voting member. What youth in this community will have trust in a commission that on the one hand informing the commission they had a vote, but once the commission is established, they have a non-voting status? I say to you that's not a way to involve youth in this community who have been subject to an inordinate amount of implicit racism. You as a city council asked us to address alternative dispute resolution mechanisms. We suggested in some detail mediation and arbitration if there are disputes between the commission and the city administrator or the police department, a way that we could resolve that so we can move on. Not a word in the city manager's proposal about any alternative dispute resolution. Trust is not bestowed, it is earned. And if the commission needs the tools provided, that the commission does need the tools provided in the task force ordinance to earn that trust. Without those tools, it is my view that the commission will fail.
Hi, my name is Lauren Tatarski. I'm a member of the task force, and a number of us are going to walk through the different aspects of the ordinance and talk you through the important pieces that we want you to be looking at. So after that important introduction, I will start here with incident review. So according to the ordinance, an incident between a community member and the AAPD can be reported to the commission for review by a community member, the commission itself, or the police. The commission may review an incident that has never been investigated by law enforcement in order to preserve confidentiality. Our framework for incident review centered two top priorities, and if you're looking at the ordinance right now, this is 3.1. The two top priorities of the ordinance are: one, the process is complainant-centered, meaning it is accessible, non-threatening, and trauma-informed, and two, there is a process of continuous informed consent, meaning that all along the way, the commission is in communication with the complainant about all of their options and the possible outcome of those options. These priorities are important because they center basic values of restorative justice. There is a process that we have delineated for incident review. Key items related to this are: one, complaints can be filed in a variety of accessible ways. Two, a complaint can be made either anonymously or not. Three, the complainant can have an advocate. Four, information managers made up of a subgroup of commission members would facilitate information exchange between AAPD and the commission. Five, the complainants are protected from retaliation. Six, the purpose of incident review is primarily forward-looking, as the commission will only have power to issue reports recommending policy changes and advice on disciplinary action. Although there is disagreement, It is our understanding of the CBA that because the commission is not an AAPD supervisor, reporting complaints to the AAPD is not required of the commission, and the complaint can be made under seal. The commission will need to consult with its legal counsel to determine if confidentiality can be promised to complainants in the case of a crime committed by police. In many provisions throughout the ordinance, we used best practices from some of the most effective oversight commissions throughout the country. In fact, the ordinance has little to no provisions that have not already been enacted elsewhere. This includes the provision of information managers, which is inspired by Portland, Oregon's Oversight Commission and allows a group of 2 or more commission members to work with the AAPD and the city to develop a system for the commission to have direct access to information. Our priority must be to create a system that invites people who have been harmed by police to share that information so that we can create a city where all people are safe and protected. If we create a flawed or incomplete system, we perpetuate the negative experiences and consequences of the current complaint and review system, and we fail to stand for the safety of people in our community.
Good evening and thank you. I'm Rich Friedman. I'm one of the co-chairs of the task force. We on the task force have many different perspectives, and though I don't agree with everything in the proposal or with everything that's been said in its favor, I will say I believe it's a small miracle that we came together after a long and very hard process and with near unanimity agreed on a comprehensive proposal. So the administrator's alternative, which doesn't just propose amendments to our work, which would have been perfectly appropriate, of course, but casts it aside, has frankly caused us great consternation. I'll be glad to answer questions bearing on the lengthy written statement that I have submitted, and it contends in particular that the legal arguments made by the administrator aren't really objections to anything that we have in the proposed ordinance. And even if they were, they would support specific changes to the proposal, not what we regard as wholesale disregard of it and replacing it by an alternative that frankly could have been drafted before we ever met and might have saved us a bit of our summer. Now I'm going to talk about the Commission's need to have its own lawyer. I think it's fundamental, and it's something that I hope City Council will focus on, that this Commission is not like others. It's not meant simply to do work for which the City Council lacks time or expertise. Rather, it's meant to provide a perspective on policing that is and is perceived to be by the public outside the normal hierarchy of city administration. Lacking that, I'm sorry, I'm not really used to applause coming from the gallery at these meetings, so I'm a little flustered here. I'm wondering if I can get some snaps. Lacking that, the Commission will do no good. If it's perceived to be part of city administration, it's not going to perform its function. And a commission can't exercise effective oversight over a police department if the same law office that advises it also advises the police. This is a point that I think is obvious to anybody outside of a corporate counsel's office or an administrative body. And it's not an idiosyncratic point. It's been recognized by cities around the country that have provided independent counsel for their oversight bodies. In some cases, after they realized that the lack of it meant that the body didn't have credibility. How can the Commission assess the validity of police conduct if the only lawyer advising it on the issue is the department's own lawyer? And if the city's lawyer says, no, you can't do that, or no, you can't get that information, well, the Commission is not going to have faith that it's getting unconflicted advice. It may be intimidated, but it's not going to have faith that it's going to get unconflicted advice. And if it's not intimidated, it's going to be tempted to act without legal advice at all if it doesn't have its own, if it doesn't have its own lawyer. It doesn't suffice to say that a member of the Commission should be a lawyer. The roles shouldn't be mixed. I know from my own experience, for 7 years I was chair of U of M's Police Department Oversight Committee, and we had to get pro bono counsel on our own when we got advice by the general counsel that struck us as bizarre, and it was, frankly, but that we couldn't ignore, and it would have intimidated us from fulfilling our duty completely if we hadn't gone outside for counsel. So having a lawyer on the commission just isn't enough. It's a mixing of roles. It's very uncomfortable, and frankly, I found that even on this task force. It doesn't suffice to say either that the commission should ask city council when it needs a lawyer. It shouldn't have to beg, and that would delay its operations. Cost isn't an issue here. There are good lawyers in town who would be willing to perform a public service pro bono or for very reduced fees. Any amount of their word, if a fee were necessary, would be a pittance. If city council is serious about setting up a meaningful commission, I believe that the most important thing it can do is to ensure that the commission has independent counsel. Thanks very much.
My name is Anna Lemler, and I'll be speaking about funding, which is on page 20 of the ordinance under Article 4, Section 4.5. Adequate funding will be absolutely critical to the success of the commission. We know from examples of other commissions across the country that one of the greatest reasons for failure of police oversight has been a lack of funding. The ordinance provides a funding baseline equal to 1.17% of the AAPD police budget, or around $300,000. This number came from comparative and thorough research and was adopted as a task force because we've learned from our work that funding will be critical to the success of the commission. The allotted funds would support an independent and impactful commission by supporting these items: independent investigators, mediators, and legal counsel, data management and analysis, victim advocates and youth staff support, administrative and community outreach staff, training and workshops for the commission, operational and other supporting costs. In the event the commission does not need the full estimated amount of funds per year, the ordinance states that unexpended funds will be held in reserve for the use of the commission. We wrote the ordinance this way to ensure that the commission will always have sufficient funds, as we know the opposite is true far too often in practice. Aside from the responsibilities already mentioned, the second greatest reason for such funding is to ensure independence. Full funding would allow a future commission the support necessary to do their work free of undue constraint. Such independence means not being bound, formally or informally, to the directives of city management. It means having the autonomy to evaluate aspects of city governance without conflict of interest. The proposed $25,000 in this year's budget that was mentioned last week is both inadequate and diminishes independence. Last year, the city spent over $200,000 on a private firm, Hillard Heinz, to create a report on policing. And this year, there is an additional $2 million in the AAPD budget. There should be no argument about the allocation of funds for the commission. Truthfully, the amount of unpaid labor and resources that we were required for the task force and community to compile this ordinance, let alone operationalize its contents, cannot be calculated. The commission, as a volunteer body, will require funding to provide this community and the AAPD with the necessary and meaningful resource. To fully fund this commission, as laid out, would be walking the talk of racial equity and our city's liberal values. Simply put, fully funding the commission is both necessary and the right thing to do.
My name is Anna Gersh. I applied and was appointed to serve on this task force. Thank you for this opportunity to speak. I was asked to speak about data and the use of data for the commission. One area of concern and agreement across the task force, the city, and the community has been the need for the commission to have access to relevant AAPD data. The original resolution directly references data access in 8 of 12 of its goals for the commission, including reporting and recommendations regarding police practices, police training and education, community education and communication by AAPD and the city, complaints and disciplinary processes and outcomes. Each item is contingent upon good access to relevant data. To both evaluate and support the AAPD, it is critical for the commission to have access to information. The city administrator referenced the city's willingness to consider a community ombudsperson. This role was discussed by the task force and the community over several meetings. Ultimately, the task force included a provision for one or more information managers, that's section 3.1.11.4, to be filled by commission members rather than an outside party. The information manager would be subject to existing laws governing confidentiality and sensitive documents. The task force decided that the introduction of a third party created unnecessary financial burden for the city and might also create a complicated social burden for the employee, as performance expectations of AAPD and the commission may conflict, potentially making the individual appear untrustworthy by the AAPD, the commission, and the larger community. The type of accessible data was also a concern. This issue is addressed in 3.2.2. Concerns regarding sensitive information are also addressed here, and legal safeguards are respected in the language of the task force document. Finally, data access is essential for the Commission to accurately assess and support improvement of AAPD culture in terms of the most prescient community concerns, specifically racially motivated decision-making, overuse of force, and underuse of supportive community organizations. Data access is critical. The task force work product has addressed this issue simply, effectively, and economically with a careful attention to existing governing documents.
Good evening. Thank you for allowing me to be heard tonight. Community, thank you for the words of wisdom to be heard by. I come before you as the 2018 Washtenaw Young Citizen of the Year. I come before you as a black teenager who has been victimized by members of the Ann Arbor community, including law enforcement. And lastly, I come before you as a voting youth member on the Ann Arbor Police Task Force to tell you about the importance of having a voting youth member on this commission. Youth are affected by most of the same issues that older members of the community are, especially when it comes to law enforcement. Now, despite this fact, there is little to no youth representation when it comes to policy and how it affects our everyday lives. And even when we are included, we're often there to be seen and not to be heard. Now, we always hear, or at least I as a youth member, always hear about, how we are the future. And yet we have little to no say about it. That is unacceptable. That needs to change, and that can change. I'm not only a voting youth member on the Ann Arbor Police Task Force, I am also a member on the Michigan Committee on Juvenile Justice, which is a statewide advisory group, and I was appointed by the governor. And I am also a member of the Michigan Juvenile Justice Youth Advisory Board, right? So I've had some experience with boards, commissions, and groups that work together at the local level, at the county level, and also at the state level already. And let me just say that as youth, we offer a fresh perspective and a burning passion like no other. I can tell you that. And more often than not, we are often overlooked. We did not do this for our enjoyment. Everybody in here knows that. I did not do this for a resume. I didn't do this to get into college. I have many, many, many other obligations. But I recognize the importance of showing up today and, of course, being on this police task force. Just earlier today, I had to pay my final respects to one of my dearest friends. And yet I choose to show up because I believe that it's important to have youth representation. Let me just end this by saying that youth are competent, we are creative, and we damn sure can get the job done. That's all on you.
My name is Kazimierz Zawodowska. I'm also on the task force. I don't have much to say, but it is my strong belief that if we at the age of 17 could be tried as adults, that we should have some kind of say when something goes wrong or someone is wrongfully accused. And we should have some kind of say or voting power in this instance. Because as a young African American, as Marquand was just saying, I've been victimized by police in Ann Arbor, in Baltimore, in Ohio. It's a curse that follows you wherever you go. And I know that this commission isn't going to stop it all over, but we have to start somewhere. But if we start on a weak foot, we'll fall over early. So I'd like the City Council to remember that, please. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm the caboose. I'm Lori Saginaw. I'm one of the privileged co-chairs of this incredible task force. And you can see why we've had so much fun at our meetings. I am extremely moved by the public turnout at this meeting. And it demonstrates to me not only the interest that there has been in our work from the beginning, but the growing investment that our community has in this incredible idea that we would like to put forward and push forward, helping you to do that. It's easy to say diverse and check a box. Diverse to us means voices not commonly heard on commissions. Change in a system as old and institutionalized as policing comes from those doing the oversight with the sensitivity and perspective most connected to where the problems arise. Why do these voices not already exist on commissions and in our government? Were they dismissed, criticized for tone or volume or choice of words? Were they considered unsuitable or uncivil or unacceptable by some standard? One of the favorite comments that City Administrator Lazarus made, and I hold it dear, is let's be comfortable with being uncomfortable. I want to say a radical thing. We are a segregated community in Ann Arbor by education, by income, by wealth, and by race privilege. The power structure mirrors that. To prioritize members who speak directly about harmful and negative experiences with law enforcement will change history in Ann Arbor. We can change the invitation that seats at the table specifically those who know directly outsider treatment. When we prioritize people of color on this commission, we mean specifically African Americans, because their experience is distinct, targeted by both law enforcement and by the white community, and managing distrust of police that is passed down generationally as a survival code. Recruitment of members must and can be different for this commission, not by those in government already, by using community networks out there and ready to help us. We've talked to them. By expanding the pool beyond Ann Arbor registered voters, because we're a main place of work and meetings for township and Ypsilanti residents. And of course, by not letting citizenship be a barrier to participation. Our draft application for commission members is not intimidating. An interview is an application option that we've proposed. The HRC needs a role because it worked in creating us. And it's contrary to the spirit of this work for selection and appointment to be controlled by one individual. We want We want the community to know that the doors of this commission are opened wide and they will be represented. Thank you.
Thank you. Want to run with questions of the task force here for Mr. Lazarus? Mr. Lazarus.
Good evening. I do want to start by thanking members of the City Council for changing the content and scheduling of this evening's work session. We had originally had something much different that you had thought about when you approved the schedule of work sessions for this year. But over the summer months, members of our community came together as part of the task force and spend many hours, not just in meetings, but separately, to develop a recommendation to the city administrator for consideration and to present to council. And I think between the meeting that we had last week to go over some of the concerns and council's willingness to consider this in a public forum this evening, if nothing else, it speaks towards the transparency of this process. You know, and sometimes government is hard, and as Lori said, sometimes we need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I think certainly I'm relearning that lesson this evening. I want to talk a little bit, just since I'm a little off the clock right now. You know, when I started here as your city administrator, one of the first things that came up was the fact that there had been no progress on the HRC's report from 2015. And it was an item of concern, it was an item of importance, and it was an item that was getting in the way of building trust. I worked with the HRC to develop the process to engage an independent entity to come in and look at the Ann Arbor Police Department's community relations processes. The report that was produced had its cynics, but it did lead us to the next step. And I sat with Chairperson Stambaugh and talked about how to recruit members for this task force and to engage with the HRC. So while it has been uncomfortable at times and difficult at times, I think there has been that building of trust and camaraderie that will serve us well as we go into the future. Many times, the task force talked about their goals being aspirational. And aspirations mean you need to knock down barriers, you need to knock down walls, and you need to get through those governing documents that sometimes stand in the way of where you want to go. My job as your administrator is to bring compliant options to this body so that it supports a robust discussion about policy, and that's what I intend to do. That progress and the road to getting to the conclusion is not always easy, but is something that we have to go through, and it has to be done with consideration of those governing documents that exist, and that does make us all feel uncomfortable at times. Oops. So how do we define success? These bullets are in fact taken from the Advisory Task Force's proposed ordinance, and they do in fact speak towards the values of this community. It means that we want to strengthen police-community relations so that the police department serves fairly, compassionately, and equitably. We want to enable independent review of police actions, and we want to ensure that all voices are heard, especially those that haven't been heard in the past. I've acknowledged the work of the task force, but we wouldn't be where we are this evening without work of the City Council, without the exceptional support that we've received from the City Attorney's Office. We have a police department that wants to improve its relationships and wants to be engaged. And we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the voices from the community, the people who never gave up and pushed us to be better than we would otherwise be and pushed us to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And in the end, we want to ensure a positive and respectful relationship so that we can be the community that we want to be. I do want to talk about some other actions resulting from the task force. I went to the vast majority of the task force's public meetings, and there were some things that came up as I took notes and came back and realized that we shouldn't wait on. So we have revised the city's policies on non-discrimination and anti-harassment. We've increased our outreach and engagement, not only in police hiring, but in all hiring. And the police are, in fact, the leaders in the city in increasing different parts of our community who may not have considered a police career before. And in fact, 40% of the applicants for city jobs come from minority entities. I said we would incorporate the commission into the process of hiring the police chief, and we're going to continue to go down that path. Some of the most compelling conversations have been about addressing reports of sexual misconduct by police officers, and we've initiated review of those procedures as well. There have been some talk about and some push primarily from the HRC about adjusting the trespass forms and practices, and we are finalizing those changes as well. I'm initiating review of your policy and bring back to you some recommendations on reimbursement as it pertains to commission member childcare, not but just for the police commission, but across the board. Because if we want to increase the diversity of representation on all of our boards and commissions, we need to recognize that there are hurdles in people attending. We also talked, and this was something that Ms. Saginaw brought up, about student stipends for attending, because students will be giving up other employment opportunities to participate, and we need to recognize that. We've designated an equity and inclusion officer in the human resources. We've performed an analysis of traffic stop data, and we will put that on the city's webpage as soon as we get the final copy. And one of the discussions, as was mentioned, was about initiating consideration of a community ombudsperson, and that's something that I hope that we can continue to look at as we look at the next two-year cycle in our fiscal plan. So let's look at Resolution 18-0197, which Council adopted on February 5th, that formed the task force. And what Council asked was that, or directed, is that the recommendations include discussions of the proposed Commission's roles in the areas you see there: education, policing practices, incident review, reporting and evaluation, and Commission membership. They also asked that the recommendations be mindful of state law, the city charter, the collective bargaining agreements, and other relevant documents, but they needed to seek changes as necessary to those documents. There have been some statements that I think are not consistent with what I actually said about things like outside counsel and some other issues, and I will address those as we go through the legal parameters. And finally, they asked that I bring to Council a resolution to establish the Community Policing Commission, detailing its roles, responsibilities, and anticipated budget. And just to go back a little bit, I had a footnote on the first slide. I have used the word Community Policing Commission because that is what is in the Council resolution. It is clear that the task force recommended a different name that they felt summarized their aspirations better. So that is not meant to ignore what the task force said, but I want to be consistent with what Council asked me to do. And then finally, the idea was to bring this back to you in September, which we've done, and then to move forward. I think we need to continue and we need to press forward on forming the commission, even while we work through those concerns about the compliance with the governing documents. And the reason for that is that we need to maintain momentum so as not to break trust. We need to make sure that we move to get a commission in place to participate in the financial cycle for the next two-year plan. And we need to make sure that the commission is in place so we can have broad public involvement on the selection of the new police chief. And I think those three reasons are valid as to why we should push forward with a degree of urgency. Our purpose this evening is up there. We want to reconcile the task force's efforts, review the impacts of the governing documents, review what I brought forward as a recommendation, and then discuss the path forward. So this was the first resolve clause in the February 5th resolution. that we look at the commission's roles, responsibilities in those areas. And I'll try and go through these quickly. The first two items are reporting and making recommendations regarding training and education, and the second is making recommendations regarding public education communications efforts of AAPD. There's not a lot of disagreement. My comment up there that I put in red is there weren't specific items, doesn't take away from the fact that the task force did recommend it in that section of their document. I would hope to continue to engage many of the same people as we break down the specifics that we would like to put into a work plan for the commission. There's been some concern about reasonableness, and as you look at the report and make recommendations, we'd like to, we'd like to see the commission put together an annual work plan, and to the extent that that requires the procurement of outside resources, we need to do that reasonably to support the commission's initiatives. Even one of the task force members said it is reasonable to program attendance at a conference, but it is not reasonable to send 10 people to Hawaii. There's a discussion about budget. You can't ignore the budget. We are financially constrained, and that needs to be addressed as well. On policing practices, the task force, the council area of interest was that we receive periodic reports and review pertinent data showing policing practices, firing, hiring, discipline, budget, staffing, complaints, training, and compliance. Also, there was council interest in reporting and making recommendations regarding policing practices. That's mentioned in one of them is in section 3.4 of the work product from the task force, and I agree with that. Same with section 3.2.1. where the work product recommends allowing the commission to review all policing practices. We have not been forthcoming with those in the past. I have committed to the task force and going forward that we will make those available for review. There are some cases, though, where things have to be done a little bit differently because those practices may put the public at risk and police officers at risk if they are disclosed, and we need to be careful. We also need to make sure that we do not disclose confidential information that is otherwise protected. Council asked about mutual development with the police department of a policing strategic plan, including community input. And there was some discussion among the task force members and the public as to whether it was their role to develop a policing strategic plan or to participate with the police department. And in the end, the red words in there as a result of a conversation I had recently and some of the written information that Mr. Friedman put in. And I think we all agree that the commission should participate in the policing strategic plan, but the commission, some of the members felt that they shouldn't endorse or approve the plan. So that's a matter for discussion. I do believe that part of this process is a collaborative one where there should be input into the annual budget and that that requirement be included in the formation documents for the commission. Item number 6 was to explore non-law enforcement public safety interventions. Again, I agree with that being part of the commission's work, but my comment there is that there wasn't anything specific, but in deference to some of the concerns that my original statement was that the task force didn't address it. They did include it in their document, but we need to develop the specifics on that. Number 7 was receive police department policies and related forms for review. I've already mentioned that wholeheartedly support that. We do need to be careful about cases where tactics would be revealed that would jeopardize the safety of the public. These next areas talk about incident review, and I'll cover them in a little more detail as we go through some conflicts with governing documents. So those are, but it was clear that council wanted the commission to have a role in incident review. Reporting and evaluations. We talked about data a little bit, and we have an open data policy in the city. All of our data should be made available for public use, except where it's otherwise restricted by law. We are balancing also, though, that concern with data security. our systems can be vulnerable if we're not careful. So I don't think there's broad disagreement on the end. There may be some concerns about the means and methods, and those are good things for the commission to take up once formed, and do it in collaboration with the city's information technology group. 18, 19, and 20 speak towards membership, and the task force provided input and recommendations in Article 2 of the document they provided, and I'll go through my recommendations on the subsequent slides as well. So the next thing council directed was that we look at the governing documents, laws, and I'm going to take us through a journey through those as well. So this is the family of governing documents that exist. The first three, which are in red, are things that up through the council, we don't have the ability to change without some outside process. We don't directly pass state statute, but we can lobby and we can help influence it. The city charter to be changed requires an election of the voters, and because we are now on a 2-year election cycle for municipal government, it does make it a little bit less timely to consider a city charter change, but it is an option that exists if there are things that need to be changed. And then the collective bargaining agreements that are in place are agreements that the city entered into in good faith with the police officer associations, and they cannot be changed unilaterally. So part of my discussion is that some things that were proposed could be handled better in those items in black. The council can adopt ordinances. They can direct things by resolution. The commission will develop a set of bylaws, and council will approve those. There are city policies and procedures that can be addressed as well, and those are very easy for us, well, they're easier for us to change than things that require a higher level of approval. Same for departmental policies and procedures. So much of what's in the ordinance, I think, can be addressed more rapidly and more quickly by doing it as a policy procedure or part of the bylaws. Boards and commissions, there was a lot of discussion over this. What the purpose of a citizen board is, and the purpose is that it's advisory, provides counsel and advice. The charter says that the administrator, the mayor, and council members are privileged to attend the meetings, and the creation of that board shall not serve to impair the authority and responsibility of the department head, the city administrator, and the city council. That's what's in the commission or in the charter for the formation of boards and commissions. Commission membership. Section 12.2B states an unpaid appointive officer to a board or commission established pursuant to law shall be eligible if he or she is a registered elector of this city, unless that requirement is waived by not less than 7 members of council. I have not done anything to tie the hands of council here. Council always has the opportunity to approve people who are not either residents or who are otherwise, by age or some other reason, are not registered electors. So it is not that there is opposition to youth membership, it is that it is council's authority to waive those requirements. On legal representation, the charter says that it's done by city council. How the council considers that is a matter of policy. It is something that should be discussed and reviewed with the city attorney and with city council. I made the statement last week that Mr. Posta and I had talked about case-by-case need for outside counsel, and that was inconsistent with what the task force talked about. The task force was essentially talking about a standing agreement. It's something that needs to be reviewed. It's something that council will have to approve. It is something that should be done with due diligence and intent, but this does not state that I do not agree with legal representation. I think it has to be defined as to what the purpose is. On contracting, Section 814 of the charter addresses contracts and where that authority is vested. And I think the task force recognized that there is a process and requirement for contracting. Same with personnel. City staff have to reside somewhere within the structure. They enjoy the benefits, the rights, the privileges, the responsibilities of city employees. People in city government do not get fired if they disagree with the city administrator. We don't do that. People here from stem to stern, side to side, are the most dedicated group of public servants I've ever worked with. They have no intent other than to serve this community fairly and equitably, and they will do their job appropriately. So the hiring of staff is something that is done through the HR director, and I think that process serves us well. Talking about some state statutes. And you can, the first one is Freedom of Information Act, and that sets the requirements for disclosure of certain public records. FOIA starts with the assumption that every record, every document is a public document unless it otherwise meets an exclusion. The city has been very diligent about making sure that documents are not unduly withheld. It has been our practice. It was practice before I got here. It will be our practice after I leave, and the state statute ensures that that will be the case because it does provide for actual compensatory and punitive damages. In some cases, FOIA is a double-edged sword as it relates to the commission, because while it ensures access to information, it also precludes information from being withheld that the commission may receive because they are an entity of the city. And I think before we assure people that when they give information to the commission, it will be held in confidentiality, we need to make sure that that is not an empty promise. Open Meetings Act, that strengthens the right of all Michigan citizens to know what goes on in government by requiring all public bodies to conduct nearly all business at open meetings. The council further strengthened that by the resolution that requires all boards, task forces, commissions, and committees and their subcommittees to hold their meetings open to the public to the best of their abilities. Council has the ability to change that policy, but that's what exists now. The task force proposals, therefore, concerning closed sessions do not appear to comply with OMA or the council elaboration on that, and they require further review. The CBA, again, I said that the city and the police union entered into the CBA in good faith, and if the provisions within there for investigating a complaint are not followed, it will impede the ability of the city to terminate or discipline an officer. There is some concern about that. Some of the questions was, or some of the statements made was, what happens if we don't want an officer disciplined? The point is that we may want that officer disciplined for bad behavior. When a complaint is turned over to the city, we have 14 days for the individual officer to be made aware of it. Beyond that, once the city is aware of the complaint, we can take a bad officer off the streets. We can give that officer administrative duty, we can put that officer on administrative leave, and we can separate that officer from the problem that he or she may be involved in. So those are things to consider about how complaints are received, and we need to comply with the collective bargaining agreement, again, that we entered into in good faith. Time limitations, timely reporting of incidents is necessary. There may be some statute of limitations that may apply. Again, it's a matter for legal review. Relations to other laws, task force document states that it prevails over all other city ordinances. That's a pretty broad policy statement that council needs to consider, and it does require some additional legal review. Dispute resolution, the draft ordinance requires mandatory arbitration. That appears to contradict the provisions of FOIA, and that also requires some additional review. And there was some discussion about subpoena power, and that certainly is a complicated legal matter that also needs further investigation. Last item, council directed that we bring to council resolution to establish the Community Policing Commission and detail its roles and responsibilities, describing the anticipated budget and staffing impact. So let me talk a little bit about why I made the recommendations. The ones that have an asterisk are those that differ from what the task force proposed, and I don't think those changes are all bad. We talked about 11 voting commissioners. There are 11 voting commissioners. I added 2 non-voting advisory members for the purpose of if there is someone that the commission would like to have participate in deliberations, be a member with all privileges except voting, they could do that on their own. And while there's some legal back and forth on it, I think since it's an advisory position and non-voting, the commission could add those members to the discussion. It is an expansion of inclusion, not a restriction. The commission can still propose, the council can still recommend and approve someone who is not a registered elector, but that's up to you to do, and I am not. I think I should not be tying your hands unnecessarily. One of the voting members should be a sitting city council member. Task Force did not agree with that. I think it's good practice in many of our commissions. It was pointed out last week that that's not the case on the Human Rights Commission, but it is the case on the Planning Commission, Transportation Commission, Energy, Environmental Commissions, and other commissions that play an important role in the city. 9 members appointed by the City Council, 1 member who is a sitting member of the Human Rights Commission. Task Force did not ask for that. I think there is an overlap between what the Police Commission is doing and the protection of human rights, and I think that's a good cross-pollination, if you will. I talked about the 2 advisory members, and then there are staggered 3-year terms for council-appointed members, and I think there's agreement on that. This statement is taken almost verbatim from the task force proposal, except for the 2 asterisk places. One is municipal law, and one is law enforcement. It was not my intention to say if someone on the commission is familiar with municipal law, that that is a substitute for outside counsel. It is someone who is engaged on a day-to-day or a recurring basis with the commission, though, who has expertise, who can help shape the discussions. The same with someone who has had some experience with law enforcement. I think it gives credibility to the commission to have someone with a law enforcement background as one of the deliberating members. And I'll add to that. Persons who have been engaged in law enforcement within the preceding 3 years should not be considered. That gives some time and space to the experience and allows people to gain perspective. What I added to this was that it's not just sworn officers, but also people who have been in the police in a non-sworn role, but directly involved in police operations. Because not everybody who helps deliver police services to the community is a sworn officer. And I provided a provision for the commission to make a recommendation to waive that requirement. So I think that's a very inclusive provision as well. It states that members shall be elected, registered electors in the city of Ann Arbor unless council waives them in accordance with the rules and regulations, which is essentially a 7-vote item. And I agree that current city employees are not eligible to be appointed to the commission. So I think that I think there's some good logic behind some of the variances from what the commission proposed, but I think it remains true to the intent. Some roles and responsibilities. Receive complaints against the police department, forward them to AAPD for resolution, including developing processes to protect the anonymity of individuals as it's allowed under applicable federal, state, and local law. There is an item of disagreement as to what the members of the task force propose with independent, separate investigations. There are some legal challenges with that. It's something that council has to look at from both a policy and a legal standpoint. The commission will have the ability to independently review reports and resolutions of complaints, investigations, and produce independent reports. Those are all things that are consistent with the intent of what the task force recommended. The commission can receive and review recurring reports from the police chief. And from what I've seen from peer cities and other cities, essentially the police chief will be part of the commission meetings. He will report on activities between meetings and give updates on things that are going on. We also do that in all of our commissions here as well. And the commission, as I said before, will review community policing policies and procedures, something we haven't done in the past, but something we are committed to do in the future. Budget and staffing impact will provide administrative and logistical support to the commission, including designation of a staff liaison to assist. This is an administrative role, scheduling, conduct of the commission meetings, getting the agendas posted, and all the other activities, ensuring that there's appropriate participation in all the commission meetings. We will make sure that the police department has the appropriate representation there. That is a strong statement. That's part of the formation documents to ensure that the commission has the resources that it needs to continue. The city attorney will designate a staff attorney with appropriate and relevant experience to support the commission. Again, that doesn't preclude council deciding that they want to have outside counsel. It is a matter of having someone available as a resource to assist the commission. The commission will develop a work plan with goals that are 2-year goals that they can put into the police department's 2-year financial plans. That will come to council for approval. Once it's in the budget, then it is there, and it is assured that the monies will be there. When we talk about, I talked before about what does reasonable accommodation mean. I think it means that we will reasonably do what needs to be done to support the operation of the commission. This is the only commission now that actually has a budget. We put aside $25,000. Council approved it in the FY19 budget. Is it adequate? Well, so far it's paid for some additional support from law students to assist in the task force proceedings. The rest of it may be used for labor, it may be used for other things. We don't know. It's an allowance. By having the commission put together a work plan that's tied to the budget, we can tie the expenditure of funds to outcomes, which is our responsibility as fiscal agents of the public dollar. So this caused, obviously, a lot of stress and anxiety that the administrator shall propose a process. The reason I started with what I started with is I proposed the process to start with to form the task force working with the mayor and other council members. That doesn't mean in any sense that I am going to pick the members of the commission. It also means that I'll present something to council for them to consider as they look at a process to make sure that we get broad and diverse representation on the commission. I think the commission has to develop its bylaws within the first 6 months of its operation. That'll define how they operate. And again, as I said before, they'll develop a work plan. And then not later than 1 year of the anniversary of its initiation, they will take all the information they have, including the task force recommendations, and present to council an organizational ordinance to be adopted into city code. The target date for council action is still October 1st. The contract for the recruiter for the police chief will be presented to council in October. That is not a violation of the commitment we made to have the commission participate in the recruitment, but it's a necessary step to get there. We want to develop an approach to recruiting commission members to come back to council at your November 1st meeting. And then we need to go through the process of recruiting members, preparing the appointment resolution in January, and our proposed target date for seating the commissioners is aggressive, but is still January of 2019. So that's, I think I've met the obligations and commitments established in the direction that council provided. I think it was consideration of the work of the task force and applicable law and other sources of information. My goal, as I said at the front, is to let's keep moving. Let's make sure we don't break the momentum and we don't break trust. So thank you.
Thank you. Are there questions from council? Either for, with respect to administrators' recommendations or task force's recommendations or proposal? Councilmember Wardlowski.
Thank you, Mayor Taylor. I have some questions for task force members. I guess one of the things where I'm just having a hard time understanding the different perspectives that I'm hearing from the task force is I heard from one of the presenters that the sense that nothing in the task force's findings are advisory, not binding, but I also heard from Ms. Harold that an understanding that they're surprised that the recommendation from the administrator is that the task force's findings would not be binding. So I guess I'm hearing, I'm not clear on your perspective on to what degree the findings and work products of the task force are advisory or binding. I was wondering if...
Perhaps we can have just a way of process to, so that there's a unified voice. Ms. Saginaw, Mr. Friedman, would you care to be the point people for answering questions?
I'm the point person.
All right, excellent.
But I will recognize whoever wants to speak to that. Yeah. Anna, go ahead.
Do you want to, Rich?
Go on, we may have different perspectives. I don't know. Go on.
Okay, should I go up to the?
Please,
the
thank you.
other one?
Yeah, this, we
Sure.
can, many of us can hear people in the room, but we're also
Sure.
going out over the internet and so forth, so.
Yeah, so I want to understand, Chuck, your question. So advisory versus binding, and what you mean by that is this kind of conversation around resolution or ordinance, right? So like, what would be law versus what is that what you mean, or no?
No, I mean, I heard Ms. Harold say that she was surprised to hear the administrator's recommendations, and that under his recommendations, the findings of the task force would not be binding. I also heard, and I'm sorry, I didn't write down who it was, say that his understanding, I believe it was either Mr. Sobel or Mr. Friedman, say that his understanding was that with, I believe it was regarding OMA, that it wasn't an issue because their findings were not binding. And so I'm trying to understand to what degree the task force envisions the findings of the commission being binding on the
Okay.
city.
Okay, that's more of a legal question.
We have avoided the term advisory from the beginning because of the connotations that it has, and we think that the commission, while it's not a policymaking body, is much more than an advisory commission. But at the same time, the contemplation was, and I think the provisions are, that the commission is not in itself a policymaking body, which is one reason why I think it would not be subject to the State Open Meetings Act. And it could make recommendations that we would expect to be listened to and would have considerable force, and if not would have particular force in the sense that to the extent that the police chief or any other city official to which recommendations are made, to whom recommendations are made, decides not to follow them, that officer would have to respond with particularity as to why the matters, why the recommendations were not being made. So that's got teeth to it, but it's not ultimately binding.
So the only binding is the access to information and the duty to make, if a policy recommendation is not followed, to respond with particularity to that?
Well, it's to provide information, to respond to reports, whether with respect to recommendations, whether with respect to individual incidents or with respect to policy, and then to discuss the matters as well. And as I said, to explain matters with particularity, including when, if for some reason, information can't be provided.
Okay, but in terms of the specific, the task force is in agreement then that the policy recommendations or the policy recommendations or operational recommendations of the task force or disciplinary recommendations of the task force, if they were making any, are non-binding on the.
They're not strictly binding in the legal
right.
sense. Yeah.
Every time one of our task forces speaks, we always listen. We don't always agree, but we always listen, and they carry weight. And I think this one would carry particular weight. My next question is on the sort of triage process for accepting complaints from the citizens. I mean, I understand what the goal of the task force is, to say you can come to us with some level of confidence that your report won't be forwarded to the police and protect you from retribution. When people come to me individually, I'm always asking, do you want me to go to the department with this? And I'm always, if you don't want me to, don't put anything in writing because it might be subject to FOIA. So in broad strokes, I absolutely understand and support that process. My question for the task force is what I think of the Jerry Sandusky situation. If somebody comes to the task force, and one of you even gave the example of confidentiality in case of crimes committed by a police officer. If there is a crime, especially a crime in which there is significant or, worse yet, ongoing harm to members of the public, is the understanding of the task force that if somebody said, sort of the Jerry Sandusky, the Penn State coach who was abusing children, sexually abusing children, that in that situation, the confidentiality request of the complainant would trump the ongoing public harm that might be caused by an officer's conduct.
We were very cognizant, because it got raised with us, that we did not want to be an instrument of continuing harm to the community by allowing someone on the police department that may be continuing or may have committed a crime, sexually assaulting drivers, and leave that person on the force. On the other hand, the victim of that comes to us. And so I think that how we came down on this is basically the commission is going to have to, in its forms, adequately inform people, for example, that if you're going to come to us and give us your name and the fact that your complaint involves criminal conduct, that we will have no choice but to turn it over to the police. The idea being that the decision-making is with the victim. The victim is given a broad range of choices of what they can do with the commission and what we're empowered to do and what we're not. And that there was a fair amount of information from the community where people wanted to come to commission and not share their name with the police because they were fearful of retaliation. And so if the person that's coming and complaining wants the police officer to be disciplined, we'd have to tell them we don't have the power to discipline. We can recommend, we can advise, we don't have that power. Again, because we have put in here that there would be individuals that would be support people that could explain these options, so in the end, it is the victim that decides the path. And that we would lay out the fact that if you're complaining, for example, about a rapist on the police department, that we would turn it over, if they told us that fact.
Can I just ask you a question? It's very interesting to me that you say sometimes people come to you with complaints. Have you ever been advised that if you didn't turn over that complaint, that you had to turn that complaint over to the police department?
I have never encountered a situation like like a Jerry Sandusky situation.
Oh,
so the complaints
I'm not even talking about the Jerry Sandusky.
No, I've never been advised that I have. The complaints that I've received have been such that I did not feel like I was either exposing the city to liability by not turning them over, nor violating an ethical duty by not turning them over.
I understand, and I agree that there may be situations in which the commission feels that it has to do it, either required by law. There's a pressing public safety interest. The reason I mentioned it is because it's been raised at us that, oh no, the commission can't keep the matter from the police because of the CBA. But evidently, you've never been told that you have to report it or violate the CBA. So.
Well, but it's also been clear to me that by not turning it over, and people have told me I don't want this reported because I don't want the officer disciplined. Right. So yes, by not turning it over, it's been clear that it has precluded discipline against the officers involved.
That's a possibility, but I'm just saying that's a choice to be made, and it's a valid choice.
And it has been useful for me, absolutely, to be able to hear these voices in the community without having them escalated to the level of disciplinary action. And I can absolutely see how the commission would have, there would be value for the commission to have sort of this ear to the ground advice,
and
as long as we're clear.
For data and to inform policy, right? To use it to collect data and then inform policy recommendations. And also I will add that the CBA, from our understanding of it, says that once the situation is reported to an AAPD supervisor, then the 14-day clock starts. So the commission is not an AAPD supervisor. So we shouldn't be liable to that part of the CBA.
And then my last question is on sort of process for generating the reports, findings, and recommendations of the commission. I understand why there are strong firewalls and separations built into the process so that people who have experienced trauma related to police actions are not, have the option, have the informed consent, as you say, to engage with the process without experiencing something that would re-traumatize them. Is it your recommendation that the commission would be able to make its findings, recommendations, et cetera, sort of start to finish without any engagement with law enforcement professionals?
If that's what they want.
What do you mean by involvement?
I beg your pardon?
What kind of involvement? I don't understand your question.
So for example, let's take it away from a disciplinary situation, although I think it's relevant there too, but a policy situation. Okay, the use of force policy needs to be changed to X, Y, and Z. Would the commission be able to do that fact-gathering analysis and deliberation without ever talking to a police officer about it? Would that be something that the commission would be empowered to do?
You mean commission members not talking to the police, or do you mean community members not talking to the police?
I mean the commission. The commission. Would the commission be using input from law enforcement professionals as part of their data gathering? Because here's the concern, right?
Absolutely.
I absolutely understand why you want the protection for people who have experienced trauma and result from police actions.
I think I'm following you, yeah.
My question is, what concerns me is this process where it looks like start to finish a whole data fact gathering and analytical and recommendation process could happen, and there would be absolutely no input from an officer. Hey, if something like this happened, what would you do? Why would it be like? What is the use of force policy? And my concern is that I recognize and agree that the law enforcement perspective should not be normative. It shouldn't decide how things should be going forward, but I think there needs to be a space to hear that perspective if we're going to figure out something that's workable moving forward. And I don't see that. I see what I see in the report is a lot of commitment.
So we are, yes, we are trauma-informed, victim-centered.
Right.
But that being said, so like for me as a task force member, right, I had many meetings with the police. I asked a lot of questions. It was very informative, very helpful for the process. Commission members would be doing the same thing. The commission is anyone on the commission who feels comfortable talking to the police and having those conversations will have those conversations. And it's actually listed in our training and orientation in the ordinance that one of the orientations would be getting information from the AAPD. And anytime the commission needs information or has questions, they would certainly go to the AAPD. The ordinance is written such that there are laws that protect people who don't feel comfortable doing that, but that in no way prevents people from doing that who are comfortable doing that. And we, as task force members, did the same thing, and we would encourage the commission to do the very same.
Okay.
Can I just add, I mean, I think the commission is going to be motivated to make recommendations that have credibility. And I think, it's going to be more credible if it's heard what the police have to say about that. So I don't think it's something that we have to spell out. I mean, we spelled out that they have the ability to get all this information from the police, and I would expect, in good common sense, if they're going to make recommendations as to policy, they're going to hear what the commission what the police have to say about it.
Further discussion? Councilmember Graham.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone who's out here tonight, and especially to our task force members. Before I ask questions, I just want to extend apologies from Councilmember Ackerman, who's on a work trip in Atlanta and is watching from his hotel room. So he wanted to make sure that his absence was not a signal that he doesn't take this process very seriously. There was a lot of consternation on his behalf on having to miss the meeting. So I'm not sure if this is a combination. Some of my questions for both staff and task force members. What I'm struggling with is trying to envision how some of these recommendations are operationalized or put into practice. The first question I have is about the hiring or the use of outside counsel. because for better or worse, with a lot of these recommendations, no matter what a commission does, council takes the blame for it, for better or worse. And we do have a responsibility for budgets, and so there's some issues of how that person would be hired, how they would be compensated, what role they would have to play. A related question that piggybacks on Councilmember Warpahowski's question is that I also heard issues about reporting, but also opportunities for dispute resolution. So would that independent counsel play a role in dispute resolution, and what would that look like? If it's not binding, then what role does dispute resolution have? So there's just some fuzziness as I'm trying to understand how this would actually be operationalized.
Insofar as dispute resolution, mediation is a process by which two parties get together, they have a dispute, and with the assistance of a third party, a mediator, not an independent counsel, a mediator, will try to have the parties work it out. It's only binding in that instance if both parties want to be bound. So that's a voluntary process to resolve disputes, and it's widespread in this county.
Do you think the outside counsel would be then advising the party that's not the police side party?
Well, it depends. I mean, does city council, does the city attorney get involved?
If there's a police officer on the other side, I'm assuming that the city attorney
Well, I
would
don't
get
know
involved.
where the dispute may be. It may be over
Right.
documents. I mean, there's a wide range of disputes that may occur. But if city attorney, just using that as example, is on one side advising it, I don't think he can just step over to the other side and then give us advice.
Sure, and I think
all
they're
I'm saying
right.
is
Yeah.
it would be situational.
Right.
Yeah.
So can I just, I'm not disagreeing that I completely understand the concern that those who are there to represent police officers on behalf of the city, that there's a conflict. I'm not in disagreement that there's a conflict. I'm just trying to understand, given that we don't have any other groups that use outside counsel, how that would actually work in practice, because we also have heard that there are some legal constraints, right? So some legal constraints in making that happen. Even in terms of just budget, if council is there to approve the budget, how would an outside group
Well, as I understand
hire?
where we are now, I mean, I think part of what got everyone upset was the statement in what you're being asked to approve, which resolved the city attorney shall be our lawyer. All right, that's what I think, that's what was said. In the presentation here, there was a footnote to that said, no, we're misreading this. This is not what we're asking you to pass. What we're really asking you to pass is there may be instances where the commission may need independent counsel, and if there is, no problem, just make a request to city council and you'll decide whether to do it or not. Well, that's a slight change from what this is. This doesn't give you that power, and it says to us we can't do it. And so we're sort of raising it in that way by saying, I mean, there's all sort of, what we're doing now is legislative history, and that this is really what we mean, but this is what we're passing. And what we're raising with you is, if you're going to pass this as is, you're sending a signal to the community that says that the city attorney shall be our lawyer. And what we're saying back to you is that's a conflict of interest in some circumstances.
Sure. Just, can I just say from the seat that I'm sitting in, and I can only speak for myself, that I look at the task force recommendations and also the recommendations of the city administrator not as where we're going in either place, right? There are recommendations from both groups, and this is why we're having a work session to get to talk some of these things out.
We deeply appreciate the work session, and we deeply appreciate your listening and hearing the views of some, hearing the views of the city administrator, hearing his views of what he's prepared to do, but it's just not in this resolution. And you have an opportunity to refine this resolution to provide on whatever level you want, in the right to get independent counsel, whether it's in some circumstances or on call.
Right, so it's something I think we're still working
Yeah.
through, and I appreciate all of your.
Can I just add that, I mean, obviously, the commission is going to have a budget, and independent counsel would come out of that budget, whatever it is, if it was necessary to make any payment at all. I mean, so council members serve without compensation, as I understand it. We serve without compensation. I can easily imagine a capable lawyer being willing to serve pro bono because it would be a valid public service. I don't think the amount would be very, very great. It depends, I mean, if the city attorney shows up at every commission meeting, then I think the commission would want its own attorney there as well.
Yes, so just one more question I just have a brief comment about the youth voting member, just also from my perspective. I believe that youth rise to our expectations and fully support having a youth voting member on that commission. Please don't clap. Just in terms of the youth voting member, just that I believe youth rise to our expectations, and please don't clap for that. Just know that that I support that provision and really appreciate both of our youth members coming out and speaking to that point. I don't usually almost cry at council meetings, and I almost cried during that part. The Open Meetings Act question. I sit on some commissions and have sat on commissions where we have closed sessions, mostly around discussion of land acquisition issues. So what I'm trying to understand, this is probably a question for our own city attorney, or maybe for both the commission and the city attorney, but to figure out how that situation differs from the request from this potential commission to have closed sessions, and why one is a violation of the OMA and one is not.
It just depends what you're going into closed session for. Obviously, if it's land acquisition, that's covered as a specific exception. So the point is that there would have to be an exception to the Open Meeting Act. And if there is, then you could go into closed session. And so your case is easy because there's that specific exception. And so you'd have to look at it. It would depend what they wanted to go in for. Yeah.
And could it be protection of victim privacy? Is that possible to go into closed session for that reason? Not being expert on the open meetings, I mean, I really don't know the answer to that question.
It depends what they're going in to do, and yeah, it would really depend. Yeah.
Okay, so I just think going forward, we need to work through some of that, further clarification of those issues.
I'm sorry, can I just say, I mean, our understanding is, I mean, it might have to be resolved, but I think the best view is that the commission would not be subject to the State Open Meetings Act, because it's not in itself a policy determining body. It is subject to the city's resolution, but that city resolution is within your power to supersede. And we think that if there isn't, in fact, an applicable exception, then the better policy determination is to supersede it to the extent necessary to protect confidentiality.
And that's why you would need full definition. And when we asked earlier on the advisory, either you're fully advisory or you're not. And to the extent that you're not, we would need to understand exactly those things that you're not advisory. And I'm not saying that you couldn't work around that in the sense that to the extent it's an advisory matter. But right now, you'd have to deal with the council, you'd have to deal with the resolution, and you need to identify specifically in any ordinance or anything else what you are not advisory on. And that is the key, because you say the state law wouldn't apply. It depends. If you're in the area that's not advisory, that you claim not to be advisory, then you would be bound by state law. You cannot have it both ways.
The commission under the proposed ordinance does not make binding recommendations with respect to policy or with respect to individual matters, so we don't think that the state law applies there. It's possible that it could apply with respect to community relations or something like that, but there I don't think the Open Meetings Act would be a problem. I mean, obviously this would have to be resolved eventually, but our view is that the Open Meetings Act itself doesn't apply, and the city should supersede the open meetings resolution to the extent necessary, and the ordinances, the proposed ordinances drafted would do that.
Right, and then there's no unwillingness to work around or look at exceptions. That would not be it, but it would be a council determination, number one, to take it out if there were no exception under the Open Meetings Act to alter your resolution to allow something. And so that's the only point about the Open Meetings Act, and that needs further work. And in fact, it would be something that you would need to do on a matter-by-matter basis. Again, I know people don't like that term, but almost all of law and everything related to the Open Meeting Act is very factual specific. And again, that's not insurmountable in one sense.
Councilmember Grant?
I know, we're going to leave time for other members to have questions.
Councilmember Lowe?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, everyone. I'd like to thank the members of the task force, the city staff, City Administrator Lazarus, City Attorney, Interim Chief Faunus, and everyone who's been involved, the community members who've engaged in this process for their work on this. Clearly, there's been tremendous amount of time and work put into this, and so thank you all and everyone who's come out tonight. And it's clear from the notes and communications that we've received, there are a lot of residents who obviously care deeply about this, which makes it all the more essential that we get this right. So if I could just follow on to this line of questioning about the role of the committee, what the proposed ordinance contemplates, because I'm trying to understand in what functions the ordinance recommends that it is not an advisory body. Mr. Friedman, I heard that you say that, and I recognize this, that the task force is not recommending that it have the authority to make decisions on police policy or make decisions regarding the disciplining of officers. But the way the ordinance is structured, the authority that this committee would have, everything from control over their own budget, ability to hire staff, ability to retain their own outside counsel, ability to compel officers or employees to meet with the commission, largely unlimited access to records and information, subpoena power. That is frankly way beyond the authority contemplating the city charter and the authority, to decision-making power. So I guess I'm wondering why then doesn't the proposed ordinance state that the commission is an advisory body?
I'm not
I
sure
guess it gets back to
I'm not sure what the point was
having
about the
it both
charter.
ways.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure what the point was about the charter. You said beyond what the charter contemplates. I wasn't sure what that, what you meant. I mean, the charter's provision with respect to commissions, the provisions are fairly bare bones, and we think that this is a special commission under 517B, not a special, simply an advisory board under 517A, and it's very wide open. The term advisory has a connotation that we've avoided, because advisory sometimes sounds as if you can make your advice and then it is just cast out on the waters, and then everybody can ignore it. And we, from the first time we started discussing substance, we said that this has to be a commission that has teeth. And at the same time, we recognized that it was not going to be a commission that was going to run the police department. So I think that it has teeth in the sense that it can make recommendations and ensure that those recommendations are, ensure that it has adequate information on which to base the recommendations, and ensure that the recommendations have to be responded to in detail. I mean, you can characterize that however you like. We felt the term advisory understates the significance.
Okay. I have a question about benchmarks. Perhaps this is for the city administrator, because I would like to better understand the aspect of how other communities like ours, you know, mid-sized university kind of communities structure their police oversight groups and their scope. Specifically, I'm interested in knowing more about the typical breadth of the scope, the authority and responsibility that they have, you know, and the organizational relationships, who they report to, how they fit into the overall organizational structure.
Thank you, council member. That's a hard question to answer because you can go from one extreme to the other. And I think there's a temptation from all of us at times to cherry pick what we like from one ordinance or one commission from another, and that takes it out of the context of that particular community. I think I can tell you what I looked at. I know that there were references made to the city of Berkeley, California as well. You know, I tried to restrict what I looked at cities that were of similar size, similar student population, were homes to large public universities, had a council manager form of government, and had some sort of policing commission. It's actually hard to find cities that meet all those requirements. So, but as you look around, I think there's variation in all of them. Some of them report to the city manager. In Berkeley, they report to a city auditor. In some places, they report to the city council. I think the proposal here that there is unanimity on is that is a function and an arm of the city council. And they advise the chief, the administrator, and the council, but I as the administrator provide logistical support, but I don't control what they do. That's no different than any other commission that we have, quite honestly, and there'd be mass rebellion if I tried to do that. I think, so it's a hard question to answer, but I think as I looked at the cities that fell into that category, which are cities like, I included Berkeley, Fort Collins, Colorado, Iowa City, Huntsville, Alabama, Norman, Oklahoma were some that fit into that category. We looked at Grand Rapids and Kalamazoo as well. And I think where we are headed is pretty consistent with those communities.
Thank you. That's very helpful to know, and you obviously did a lot of benchmarking. Because again, I think it's, you know, it is also, just to put this in, to sort of, I don't know, dimension this, and just see how these recommendations fit with what is most common and, you know, what may be the extremes, and what's typical with good benchmark comparisons. It's helpful, so thank you for that.
University cities also tend to be a little more progressive, so that's why we'd focus on those as well.
Could I jump in response to your question? Sure. So there is a National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, NACOL, and they have a very useful website, and they give a list of jurisdictions all over the country, and we looked at those that we felt were comparable, and it's very informative because we can look up their annual reports, we can understand the sizes of their bodies, we can know their operational structure, and they are, as Administrator Lazarus says, all across the board. What we really tried to do was respond to what we felt suited our needs and what we heard our community saying that they needed in the context of the history of Ann Arbor and the experiences and the frustrations that citizens have had with adequate communication and information coming from the police department. And we do look very much forward to building a collaborative working relationship. It's clear to us that we could not have written this document without many, many hours and many, many emails going back and forth with Deputy Chief Forsberg and many of the members of the department. So we would be happy to share with you the specifics on the communities that we really were inspired by, were excited by, but it's happening out there, and we can do it too.
Thanks. I noticed that Mr. Friedman, in a footnote, you cited, you called out that the task force used the oversight body of Berkeley as a benchmark, and did note that, yeah, it's in your footnote, one of your footnotes at Berkeley, the commission is part of the city's administration, organization. Sorry. Yeah, okay, sorry about that. I have a question about the police department's, it's on. I'm too short, or something's going, sorry, I'm doing to swallow it perhaps. Question about the AAPD involvement. On this, and this is something I brought up before, the consultant that we hired, that the city hired, stressed to us that while the potential relationship building power in a policing commission was obviously significant, it was also the joint shaping of policies and police, community-oriented policing kind of cooperation that builds that relationship. And again, I addressed this before because this is a genuine concern I hold, because it seems, though, that most of the focus and discussion is on incident review, the incident review role of the commission, rather than the joint cooperative policy-making role. So perhaps I'm wrong. Let me just, hang on a sec.
Yeah, sure.
Perhaps I'm wrong. If so, please correct me. But I am interested in understanding how the commission will engage the Ann Arbor Police Department positively and proactively in reviewing and implementing best practices and policies.
Thanks. Councilmember, I can appreciate that if one looks at the ordinance, you see a lot of space taken up by incident review and relatively little by policy matters. And I think the explanation is simply because we felt that there's a need to go into detail on the incident review because it's a particular process that involves individual complainants and choices and the need for confidentiality and the need for information and all that. With respect to policy matters, it was relatively simple. Just say, well, the commission can make recommendations on all policy matters, and here's the information it gets, and this is the response. So it's not meant to say that the commission should spend more of its time on incident review or anything like that. I mean, I think that's going to depend on how many complaints the commission receives.
Okay, thanks.
And our hope certainly is that the commission would be very proactive in engaging with the police and trying to determine what policy.
I appreciate that, because there was no deep dive into engaging the police positively, proactively, exploring best practices, all of that, so.
I want to turn the clock back a little bit. When you asked about who we looked at, I'd spent over 2,500 hours doing research before this task force was put together. I cherry-picked. In my mind, we don't want to be a carbon copy of someone else because we have never had justice in this country. I have aspirations, but I don't like the word aspirational. What I want to see is something that will stand the test of time. I shared with you, I have 4 sons. I have 3 grandchildren. I have 5 brothers. I sit at the top of a family that actually uses the word patriarch. I do the funerals in his family. I don't want to do the funeral of a son or a grandson. I'm talking to everybody. I'm looking at you, but I'm talking to everybody in here. So I'm not going to say, let's copy Berkeley or let's copy Norman, Oklahoma. I'm going to say what will be the absolute best, even if it does not exist at this moment. That's what I'm with.
Thank you. And I'll just say, the kinds of benchmarking question I asked here is something my colleagues would say, you know, it's typical Jane kind of question. And so I'm just trying to wrap my brain around, you know, what others do. I think it's a fair question. You know, what's most common? What are the extremes? You know, because obviously, you know, other communities have been at this for a while, and I'd like to know, you know, what those kinds of best practices are too. So that's just.
See, forgive me for showing my passion. I've also buried 2 cousins that were killed by police. So for me to act objective, I can't. I'm not mad at you because you're trying to deal with something in a couple hours that I spent over 3,000 hours on. It would be totally unfair for me to be mad at you. But it also would be disrespectful to myself to act like this is an intellectual discussion. It is not.
I have some other questions, but I probably should.
If I could just add, you know, I've had the opportunity and privilege to work with Mr. Wilson for a while, almost since I got in the door here. And one of the things that I neglected to say before, you know, the process that the task force went through, and I sat through, it was difficult in a lot of ways, but one of the ways that initially was difficult but wound up being helpful is it causes you to go through a lot of self-reflection and learn how to listen again and learn how to do those things. And our commitment to the community is not in any way wavering because we're trying to figure out how to do this in a way that fits Ann Arbor best. I mentioned at the beginning of, you know, the presentation I gave is that we're not stalling, we're not trying to not get to the end, but to go through a process where we have to take the, you know, the vision that I think and I hope we share and put it through the wicket of all the things we have to do is difficult, and we're going to have periods where we're going to disagree on means and methods, but we're never going to waver from the end. So I think, you know, in fairness to Councilmember Lum, what she's trying to do is get into a level of detail that helps us get to a place that sustains itself over time. It's not, Dwight, that you don't trust me. It's that this has to be in place after you and I are both long gone, and it has to be survivable. The concern is that what's the most reasonable worst-case situation that we should envision in putting together an ordinance? And this ordinance, as it is, has some things that we still need to work on some. So the commitment here is to continue to work in a way that is responsible, meets the goal. And I'm not trying to lecture. Please don't take it that way. It's just that we're all committed to do it, and I think there are some reasonable questions that we need to ask.
Thank you very much.
Councilmember Westfall.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I guess along the same lines, some more questions. There were questions or some disagreement that seemed to be raised about the collective bargaining agreement and 14-day, clock. And maybe this is not something that can be solved in a discussion tonight, but is there some more color that you can give as to how, I don't know the case law, I don't know how other communities handle it, if they have similar CBAs that we do. So models exist across the board, it sounds like, and each agreement is negotiated separately. But is there something that can help us right now move that discussion forward a little bit? Sure, about and I that? had
Nancy Niemela, who's been here 15 years, but unfortunately she had to leave, so she'll provide some more direction to the council. But the issue of looking at other cities, and again, why it's good aspirational. You may see another city that has a program that you like, and in fact, in a city like Ann Arbor, we have this all the time. But the thing you need to ask, and what part of my advice is, you have to ask, well, they have this program, but what are their constraints under their collective bargaining agreements? If they don't have the same constraint under the collective bargaining agreement, you can't just say, well, we want to model ourselves after Norman, Oklahoma, or Berkeley, or anywhere else. That's what you have to look at, because those things are in some ways irrelevant. Now, I will point out that with the collective bargaining agreement, that is something, as the city administrator said, that is not carved in stone. It's carved in stone for 2 years in an agreement, but that can be changed, and that is up to the council to renegotiate that agreement if, through the course of the next 2 years, there are issues that become so important to the commission and so important to the council that will then rise to the top. And that's my caution on grabbing a comparative. And it's the same way. What cities that have the same charter language have these things? And again, the aspirational things are great, because if in fact there's an impediment in the charter, and I'm not saying that there is, change the charter. I've instructed the council on many different very controversial topics where I've said state law is binding here, but you can change state law. Went right up to Lansing, and on behalf of the council, changed the state law. And so it's not to both lecture people about the law, but to look at what the immediate constraints of, and that's why even when I'm looking at these issues and talking to the people on the council, there is problematic language in the ordinance to me, and right now. There is, and I've identified that. You all know what that is. The collective bargaining agreement, again, we can and the mayor suggested we'll put out some more information. We believe it's problematic not only because to suggest that there's going to be a pre-investigation or a contemporaneous investigation is a problem with the CBA. There's no doubt about that. And so the council's going to have to deal with that. On the other hand, like I said, the CBA can be changed. I know that there was confusion, and I think that was right. What this independent review is. Right now, when we got started, the independent review was an after-the-fact review of internal discipline, and that, for the most part, is still intact in this proposed ordinance. And again, we can't pretend that that is not the method that's going to that's going to take place. On the other hand, we'll see. Maybe it works perfectly to people's satisfaction. Maybe not. And if not, things can be adjusted. The council will look at it. But we need to be very clear in any ordinance or in any resolution exactly what the parameters and the rights and responsibilities are, so there's no confusion. And again, there is confusion right now on the scope of the ordinance. You just have to understand it. You've heard it among your own members who spoke tonight. And again, that is not a criticism. It's a recognition that an important ordinance needs to be drafted very, very carefully so people know what is there. And there's not down the road, we need to have outside counsel to determine what the meaning of this ordinance is. If you need that, that's a problem in drafting the ordinance. I'm telling you, that's problem 101.
Can I just say that I'll just refer you to page 4 of the statement that I submitted earlier, because I think it addresses the CBA in detail. And I don't think it's the degree of concern that people suggested. And boy, the idea that if there's uncertainty in implementing an ordinance, that's a problem in drafting the ordinance, that would be a surprise to most lawyers, I think. The idea that an ordinance this complex is going to resolve all issues and not leave any uncertainty as to application. And if that's true, I'd sort of be out of a job if it were that simple.
Councilmember Westphal, you still have the floor.
Okay, I guess if a member of the task force could stay up just for a follow-up question. I'm sorry, thanks. I appreciate you responding to that. And I did read your statement. I probably didn't digest it as thoroughly as I should.
And I'm happy to follow up afterwards, you know.
Okay, so, I mean, to me, the worst outcome would be a situation where there is some ambiguity that leads to a problem not being resolved and, in fact, being perpetuated because the agreement wasn't followed, for example. I mean, ambiguity, we deal with ambiguity all the time. I think there's very high stakes in this circumstance. I mean, is there some acknowledgement that this could be problematic and needs to be addressed in good faith at the next union agreement?
Well, I mean, we didn't say that, but I mean, if the council chooses to try to open up the union agreement, of course it can. I mean, I think the problem would be no worse than if a complainant never comes forward with a complaint at all. So let's say because she's intimidated or scared, and so it's not putting us in a worse position because of that. I think it's a matter that the meaning of the union agreement would have to be resolved. I mean, there's no way, as I understand it, resolving it short of arbitration. So the first time this comes up, if it does come up, then perhaps there would be an arbitration, then we'd know. You know, I'm not sure we can do better than that. Obviously, if the council wants to make this something that in the next union arbitration is opened up, then it can. But I'll repeat what Lawrence said. Our view is that that the agreement does not start the clock running when the commission receives a complaint. And when I met with the with Mr. Postma and Nancy, they said, well, that's the position they would advocate. Union would take the opposite position. But I mean, that's a plausible position, that the clock does not begin to run. I think under the terms...
We simply disagree on that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it wasn't, Nancy did say in that meeting, that's the position we assert, and there's no way of knowing until the arbitration, you know, so.
Okay, thank you.
That's what we said.
Thank you.
Councilmember Westphal?
Good for now, thanks.
Further discussion? Councilmember Warpahowski.
Thank you, Mayor Taylor. I may be going too far down a rabbit hole on this issue, but what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to reconcile the perspective of the task force that that the commission would not be a public body and therefore exempt from the OMA, Open Meetings Act, and the Open Meetings Act is for, you know, if the bodies are making governance decisions, then it's a public body and not subject to the OMA, and if it's not making governance decisions, it's arguably not. What I'm trying to understand is how the ordinance proposes that the task force would have the ability to make decisions, not just recommendations, but decisions on things such as the selection of outside counsel. And I'm trying to understand how that governance level decision-making ability lines up with your reading that it's not a public body under the OMA.
Its decision-making would only be as to its own operations. And any body can make decisions as to its own operations. Other than that, it has recommendation power, but it wouldn't have the power to decide. But if it chooses how it's going to operate, I don't think that brings it within the OMA. I mean, Look, we've proposed what we think is the best possible resolution, and I understand that maybe there could be an issue under the OMA, and if that's lost, then as Dick Sobel said at one of our meetings, well, the commission's not going to go on operating illegally. If it turns out that it couldn't operate in the way that we envisioned, then it would have to be rethought. But we do think that preserving confidentiality is important. It's pretty essential in this context that there may be some circumstances in which the OMA itself doesn't provide sufficient protection, and so I think taking the position that the OMA does not itself apply would be important.
Further discussion? Councilmember Eaton.
Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking the members of the task force. I didn't attend every meeting or every hour of your meetings, but I did attend enough to know just how hard you worked. And I really want to thank all of the community members who regularly attended those meetings as well and vigorously made input. And I want to thank everybody that came out tonight. This is really a good show of support for something that's really near and dear to my heart. I don't believe that this is the point in time that the city of Ann Arbor should be timid. This may not be a perfect ordinance. I don't know that I've ever seen a perfect ordinance come before us. And yet, that's not reason to just dismiss it and adopt something watered down or lesser in the form of a resolution. In July, we passed one community resolution here that speaks to racial equity throughout our community in every aspect of the work that our government does. And for me, the proposed ordinance that came out of the task force is just an essential step in that desire to address racial equity in this community. Often, you'll hear council members talk about the moral imperative to do one thing or another, and I cannot think of anything that we've considered up to this date that has such a moral component necessitating real action rather than watering down the efforts of this commission, of this task force, and quibbling over this detail or that detail. Attorneys will disagree with each other. That's pretty clear to me. I actually am an attorney, so I believe that this ordinance will not be the final step that we take in this endeavor. We'll be back next year to tinker with it, to make sure that we correct the things that are not perfect with it, that we try to strengthen what needs to be strengthened, and try to remedy what's flawed. And that's how law is. You don't just get one bite at it, but you really have to take that first big step when you're doing something this important, and then come back and look at it again and again and again. And that's why it really excites me that there are so many people who are so involved in making sure this happens, is because you're not going to just let us off the hook now. You're going to watch the formulation of this commission, and you're going to watch how it works, and you're going to watch how we react to how it works and make sure that we make those improvements that are necessary. So rather than dismiss this whole proposed ordinance just out of hand because there may be a flaw here or there, I think that we need to bring it to council and debate its particulars. And I will be offering this ordinance that's coming out of the task force in October. And I assume that I will have a co-sponsor at the far end of the table here. And I will welcome my colleagues to offer meaningful amendments where they see problem or where they see weakness. But fundamentally, we need an independent oversight commission. That commission needs to be empowered. It cannot be gutted at the beginning. But really, one of the things that the task force took on that we haven't discussed much here tonight is that it has to be adequately funded, because the members of the commission need to have the training and orientation to understand the subject matter. If we start a commission without adequate funding, then it will fail from the beginning. And I just don't think that anybody in this community should be willing to accept that. So I will propose this ordinance as it's been brought to us, and I look forward to that discussion among my colleagues here. Thank you so much.
Councilmember Kalasapathy.
Yeah, I think part of the issue is some emphasize, some community members or community as a whole emphasizes the oversight aspect of this commission. So whether it's incident review or complaints or looking at policy in terms of racist bias. So that has been a focus of majority of the community members who have been coming to the meetings and giving us feedback, and to the police oversight board. And then there's another aspect of it. Bear with me, I hope nobody takes offense of this. It's a privileged kind of perspective, which is like this commission there is to build trust. I think trust, for most of us in personal relationships or your trust with the government or your elected, you don't just say, okay, I'm going to trust this person. That trust is earned, right? So I feel that trust can be earned only if we set up a police oversight board that is independent. Because even if it is perceived that is part of the police department or they are to do PR work for the police department, I think we are better off not having a police oversight body, because there's really, because that's almost like, I don't think that's the role. We should not be doing that. So if we are going to have a police oversight body, that independence, and for me it's kind of disturbing, like initially what was coming out of the city administration is, oh, no commission or committee has a right to hire legal counsel. That's how legal counsel is hired. We are not saying that the police oversight board is going to go out and put an RFP and get a legal firm to come over. That is done by the city council. But what we need to set up in the ordinance is making sure that there is funding, and the city council makes sure that there is independent legal counsel there. And I take conflict of interest very seriously. A person cannot be on both sides. It's like taking the CFO of a company and saying, okay, you can do the books, and then you're going to be part of the audit team. I mean, it doesn't work that way. You need to have the city lawyers are there, the city legal team is there to make sure it defends the city vigorously, it defends the police department. That's their role. But if there is issues, we need to, so it's not like the city attorney is going to evaluate individual cases and say, okay, you get to have legal counsel here, independent legal counsel in this. No, the whole process should be independent. Otherwise, we can say all what we want about how this commission is going to build trust. That trust is built with our actions and respecting what the community has wanted, which is independent. And when we say independent, it has to be independent. And I think if we keep that spirit in mind when we are passing the ordinance, administrative issues can be overcome. I really think. I mean, just like hiring the independent legal counsel, the police commission doesn't have to hire it. City council will pass a resolution, and it will go through the RFP process, and we'll hire that. So for me, I think we can do it, and I believe it will pass the test of time, and we always say Ann Arbor needs to be the star or the best model city. And I think this is one way we can show not only other cities, the world, that it can be done, and it can be done with integrity, not just for show, but with honesty and truthfulness. Thank you.
Further discussion? Councilmember Bannister.
Okay. Well, I would like to agree with Councilmember Eaton and Councilmember Kalasapathy and be a co-sponsor on this resolution for October. And I would like to thank all of the task force members for your excellent speeches tonight. Those were very moving. And one of the questions on my mind is I understand what you all are saying, and I understand the 5 things that are in your request that are of disagreement of points with the city. But what I would like to take a minute to do before we then get on to the public comment, I would like to ask Mr. Lazarus if we could translate into plain language, if possible, the 5 things that the task force has recommended that your recommendation was finding a problem with. And so like the big one is that sort of joint issue of the independent council combined with the funding of the 1.17% and the 300,000. And I understand why we would want those, and that is the #1 reason why these commissions have failed around the country is the lack of funding. And could you explain to me just in plain language what the problem is from your report on that, or your recommendation?
So I'm going to object to the characterization just in general. As I have stated a couple times, my perspective is that we have to go through the wickets of the legal structure that exists to get to the end where we share a vision. Having said that, the charter is clear about how legal services or outside legal counsel is obtained. I am not going to tie this council's hands through ordinance. It's up to this council and future councils to determine under what means and what circumstances that they want to provide outside legal counsel to anybody, whether it's the police commissioner or anyone else. I would be remiss if I didn't point out those charter requirements. The point of having the city attorney provide a staff attorney to support the council is that many questions are procedural and they're interpretive of laws and regulations in the charter. We have exceptional attorneys in the city attorney's office who can provide that and help the council do its business. But there may be times where outside counsel is needed, and that is up to the city council, hopefully with recommendations from our city attorney as to how that's obtained. From a budgetary standpoint, just as Mr. Postum has said, you have to consider how cities are shaped. You also have to consider how support is provided. When you refer to the city of Berkeley, they have a separate office. It's fully staffed. Out of the I don't know, it was $520-some thousand they had in their budget. The vast majority of that was for salaries and for related staff support. And when you subtract all of that out, what was left in the FY18 financial plan for the city of Berkeley for the Police Review Commission was $27,000. We put $25,000 as a placeholder in this year's budget. We provide for staffing and support costs from other places, from the city administrator's budget, from the police department's budget. So if the intent is to put those resources out of that budget, I don't think we're that far off. But fundamentally, good government would indicate we tie allocations of funds to work plans and projected outcomes, and then each year When we look in the off year of the budget, we look and see how we're performing in comparison to the work plan, and then in the next 2-year cycle, we adjust as to what's needed. And I think that's good government, it's good budgeting, and I think it's an accounting matter of where the dollars are. And I think by taking an approach that we're going to support development of a work plan from the commission and then providing funding, and there has to be a reasonableness test to it, I think they won't fail for lack of funding.
Okay, thank you for that. What could you put in a nutshell, plain language, the objection to the youth voting member and the appointment of members?
My point was that the city charter requires that appointed officers of the city and on commissions are registered electors under the city charter. Future councils may choose not to appoint a youth member who is not a registered elector. This council probably would. But as I mentioned when we're talking to Mr. Wilson, we need to make sure that things endure. So over the course of time, if this commission has the opportunity to put 2 people who are advisory in nature, have full benefit of being on the commission except voting, we can provide assurance that there will always be the opportunity for the commission to appoint people who may otherwise be underrepresented or be representative of underrepresented parts of the community, and it provides them with assurance that that voice will always be heard. But it is fundamentally up to the council to determine whether or not, by 7 votes, to waive the requirements of being a registered elector in the city of Ann Arbor.
And then lastly, I think the task force has recommended receive and investigate versus receive and refer. And
that's a core issue. I think what we just talked about are things that are, I think to your point, they may be a matter of putting them in clear language, but the fundamental issue of how complaints are handled is core to this ordinance. It is why I believe the ordinance is not ready for adoption. It needs to be worked out further. There is I think, not a common thread as to what the incident receipt and review means. And council's policy decision is this a review of actions that have been investigated, find out why something happened, whether the processes in place were adequate, did the police officer respond in accordance with those procedures, and here's how those procedures should be changed. I don't think there's any disagreement that that is a core function of the commission. The question for council is, are overcoming, assuming all the legal concerns can be overcome, should there be a separate investigatory process that is done? And that is the core issue that has to be determined and has to be decided. And that is entangled with a lot of different legal aspects, the collective bargaining agreement, and it is something that's going to take some time to address, which is why I recommend let's get the commission in place. Let's do it by resolution so that there is wiggle room to do these things, and then we adopt bylaws and we adopt an ordinance. That's the basis of my recommendation.
Thank you.
Further.
May I just respond briefly to a few of those points? With respect to council, I don't think there's a charter problem because even if the charter provision does require city council action, the proposed ordinance says in section 4.4, the city council shall take such actions as may be necessary under the charter to ensure that the commission has counsel of its choice. So, it's a directive by the council to itself. With respect to the youth member, section 2.6 provides adoption of this ordinance by 7 members of the city council shall be deemed to be a waiver for purposes of section 12.2B of the city charter. So I think we've taken care of that. It's a waiver in general. And let me just say, I mean, based in part on my experience with the U of M committee, it's my hope and actually my expectation that in most cases, the commission would find it best to refer matters to the police department, see what they present, and then ask whatever questions and do whatever investigation that's needed. I think that's most efficient. It makes for the best interchange and all that. So in that sense, there's not any real disagreement as I understand it. But we have provided that if there's reason why the commission feels that it needs to begin on its own, it can do that. But I really do hope and expect that the usual would be, what we found, and we weren't directed to do this, but usually we get a complaint, we want to say, okay, police department, what do you have to say about that? And then proceed from there.
So with all due respect, Mr. Friedman, I live in a world where we have to enforce ordinances, and when they are severely flawed, it creates problems for us. We live in a world where we have to balance budgets, where we have to hold people accountable, and we live in a world where we have to ensure that the safety of the public and the safety of our police officers is maintained. And that is done through good, strong, solid language. It is done by, as I've quoted, measuring twice, cutting once, to quote an old Carpenter's credo. And I think we will get to the end that we need to get to. We are arguing here primarily about means and methods, but there are assurances that have to be provided to all parties involved. Trust is built on a two-way street, not a one-way street, and checks and balances also work both ways. You spent a lot of time talking about what the intent of the commission should be, but I don't think we capture that language. City attorney has provided some alternatives to be included, to be very clear about what the intent is. And as I talked to, what I mentioned when I was talking about Mr. Wilson, we need to make sure we understand what not the worst thing that could ever happen is, because that would bind us up in an endless cycle and we'd never get through this, but we have to come up with a reasonable thought of what's the most likely worst thing that would ever happen. And I think the task force's work is invaluable in that. The resolution that I've written says that the commission shall consider the recommendations and studies from the advisory task force. We are not throwing anything away. We are proceeding with due diligence. The public will hold us accountable for how fast we move and the outcomes.
Well, the problem is that you're telling the commission basically start over.
I'm not saying that.
Well, yes, you're saying your resolution is bare bones, and it doesn't have most of the content of the task force proposal, and it's saying the commission should present a possible ordinance in a year. So it's basically saying, do what the task force did, and if so, I pity the commission that they'd have to go through that.
No, that's neither true nor fair.
I don't disagree with you in saying that measure twice, but the fact is that then the response is to amend the language of the ordinance, not just wipe the slate clean and do something you could have done without.
So let me go back to what I said. There are other forms of governing documents besides an ordinance that can be adopted very quickly. And we can have a commission in place that can address those as they develop their bylaws, and that has a more immediate impact. We need to provide some stability and continuance to the police department. I've committed that we're not going to go forward until we can have some interface with the police commission. Those are real-world concerns that need to be addressed.
I appreciate that. I just think it's important that the city council consider the ordinance that we've presented with such amendments as may be proposed, and I'm glad to hear that will be presented.
Councilmember Lohner.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. And to follow on to this exchange, and I commend you, Mr. Lazarus, for standing, firm on, I know I'll get hissed and the signs will be raised as they just were for the city administrator, but I'd like to, for us all to exercise mutual respect for, so much for that, I guess. I would. So, again, to follow on, but thank you, Mr. Lazarus and Mr. Friedman. The task force's proposed ordinance does state, quote, this gets to this, what prevails here. Quote, to the extent this ordinance conflicts with any city law of any type, including without limitation, any ordinance, rule, regulation, or executive order other than the city charter, this ordinance shall prevail. And I will just say that whenever I see strong language like that, sort of saying this is the greater among equals, it gives me pause. And I was going to ask, someone to comment on that language, but I think I just heard that from this last exchange. And I sense that it could be problematic. and if it is problematic at all, if it could cause issues down the road, that's something I think at least I think is something that we should fully understand, the ramifications of anything, any kind of recommendation like that. So, thank you.
Sure.
Let me ask a process question.
Yeah.
I am just wondering, and this comes from your question and the prior conversations and debate that we're having, is that when Councilmember Eaton, when you said that you would like to propose it as an ordinance, what is the process for that?
So broadly, the process, council members have broad rights to put items on the agenda. And so, we haven't conferred about this, but, when council member says that they plan on doing that, typically they'll put the language, they'll provide the language that they're interested in putting on the agenda to the city clerk, identify that this is a proposed ordinance, then it will come in the council agenda, the ordinary course, with whatever sponsors are associated with it.
Okay, so that would mean more specifically that on October 1st, a potential agenda item would be proposed by 3 council members for this to be processed as an ordinance process, right? So so what I mean is that this conversation that's happening right now, which is very robust, and as we've discussed, we've done 5 months of this, right? Others have done much longer than some other members, that this requires more conversation, this requires more discussion. And so my understanding is that if it's an ordinance, is that there's a reading, or definitely 1, possibly 2, and then there's a public hearing and a vote, right?
There are public hearings associated with the second reading of the ordinance.
With the second reading, okay. So if this is proposed as an ordinance on October 1st, then what is the exact process after that? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
The process broadly is that it'll be, if indeed it is brought forward at that meeting, then whatever results from that, let's assume something passes in amended form or otherwise.
Yeah.
At that point, it would go to second reading at a near and subsequent meeting. At that meeting, there would be a public hearing. Public hearings are, places where folks without signing up in advance can come and speak on the language of that ordinance. They'll have 3 minutes in which to speak, and then the item will be on the agenda. If it's voted on, then it's voted on. If it's amended, it depends upon the nature of the amendment. If the amendment is material, then it goes back to an additional second reading, at which point there'll be an additional public hearing.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Sure. Councilman Lum, still
And just to follow on to that, if I may, as you know, we also have a draft resolution. This is another, approach, and the third resolve clause in the draft resolution states that within 30 days of council passing the resolution, the administrator would propose a process for recruiting, the initial membership of the commission, et cetera. So it's detailed there too, because we have the task force report, we have the proposed ordinance, we have the administrator's, recommendations, the resolution, draft resolution, supporting analysis, on and on and on. There's various next steps. I'm simply clarifying that, trying to, share all the options so you have a full understanding and appreciation for possible next steps.
Thank you. So procedurally, what I'm hearing possibly is that so we have a proposed ordinance from the task force, and then there's a proposed resolution that may also be put on the agenda for the October 1st meeting to be discussed or debated.
That's one option that we're all aware of.
Okay.
Sorry, what was the question?
The question was, why don't you tell the public? So I'm not sure if people understand that there is a resolution.
I'm still going to be.
The agenda's not been drafted.
We don't
It is
have.
unknown what will be on that
Right,
agenda.
thank you, Mr. Mayor.
At this point,
With all agenda items, we ask questions, so there'll be, we have well over 100 pages that were given to us on this matter.
Sure.
That we're all digesting. This is our first working session, so.
Yeah, I bring the procedural question just because clearly there's much more discussion that needs to happen.
Some of the email responses, I didn't get to everybody, I'm sorry, I'm going to do that after this. It's just a matter of digesting all this. We're all doing the best we can to absorb everything that's been presented to us.
Yes, and thank you. It's not about questioning your intentions. It's just about us fully understanding what the process is.
Right.
there was somebody over here. Councilmember Bannister or Kalasapathy? I didn't recognize what. I'm sorry. Councilmember Kalasapathy.
Yeah, but I'm a little concerned about this, as Mr. Lazarus said, we need to really get this going fast because we need to get the commission seated because they're going to influence the ultimate who is going to be our next police chief, the hiring of the police chief. I'm just afraid when you push something through this, and if Mr. Lazarus is going to be the one who is going to let council know how we are going to recruit, yeah, we might get a commission seated, and they might play a role. But it's almost like I feel we are seating this body to kind of rubber stamp whatever they're going to do. And I feel that's the wrong reason to rush through this and push through this. And then we're going to say, oh, see, we got a great chief because the police commission also interviewed the police chief. I don't think that should be the goal. If it takes a longer time, let it take the time. I have a real problem, I'm going to be very honest, that Mr. Lazarus is going to formulate the whole recruitment process. I think there has a lot of discussion being done by the police task force, and they have identified that we have to go through the Human Rights Commission and other community organizations to get the recruitment, because again, I'm going to say the dirty word, it's the privilege. We tend to get people who are like us, who think like us, who are educated like us, and that was really discussed in depth at the police task force. How do we get people who were incarcerated and who are out, who have real experience about being stuck? So I really feel like, I'm not trying to put you down, Mr. Lazarus, but I think there are other community groups and other institutions that are much more able to get these kinds of people, because this is not like any other commission. Because sometimes we say other commissions don't do this. This is not going to be like any other commission, because we are going to find people who are not in the other commissions. It's going to be very different, because it's going to subvert the power structure. It's not going to be status quo. All the other commissions are there to keep the status quo. This is going to question the status quo. So I think we need to be very cognizant, and let's put the brakes on. Because I really don't want to have anything to do with the commission that's going to be seated to rubber stamp the next hiring of the police chief. Thank you.
So the resolution states that I'll propose a process. That clearly indicates what that process is subject to the approval of council. It's not my place to tie the hands of council of how that recruitment process goes or how they choose to select members. If the council chooses to cede some of that discretion to another body, that is the council's decision to do that. There is very good reason for continuing as I said before, the momentum. The task force process for most of the members was rather exhausting. And I think if we were to let ourselves get bound up in endless debate, we would lose both. We'd lose faith and trust and confidence. So I think going through a process to recruit, and it also says that the process for recruiting the initial membership and a schedule for forming the commission. I've gotten feedback from the council as to what they would want in that process. I've heard and listened and watched what comes out of other boards and commissions. I've sat and listened and had some conversations with members of the task force. I think I understand what the values and what the needs of the community are. I think we need to maintain our foot on the accelerator to get a commission in place. And I would not dismiss the need to have certainty on what the commission is as we recruit a police chief. The police department has been without a permanent chief. An interim chief honest has done an exceptional job, but we need to have that process in place. That process and the applicants we get will be governed by what the commission form looks like. And as it is now, we'll be fortunate to get a police chief in place by March, which is a year since Chief Baird retired. So I think those are all legitimate points. I think we will do this in a way that keeps faith with the community, honors what the council has set up as the values they'd like to see, and ultimately, it is council's decision as to how they want to recruit those members.
Councilmember Kalasapati, you still have the floor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just have a comment to Councilman Loom, is it? Lum. I just wanted to point out, and I think you're aware, that we had 3 lawyers sitting on the task force.
Yeah, I know
who
them.
investigated deeply into the issues you're talking about. And you'll see in the ordinance at many different points, it states that these provisions are subject to city law, to the city charter, to the CBA. And we've put that in many different places so that the
understand.
commission
Thank
is
you.
aware that those things might prevent certain things from happening and that they would need to respond to that. That this ordinance is not, there's nothing written that would break the law because those things are written in by the lawyers on the task force. And I also want to mention that the will to do this is up to you all.
Right.
So you make the laws. If you have the will, you can make this happen.
Right, it's not-
happening in other
right.
states. It's happening in other
Well,
jurisdictions.
we can.
There is a way if there is the will. And I will also say that as one of the task force members has reminded us all that slavery was once law. And so when we talk about the laws and the way they've been made to perpetuate a certain status quo, it takes a little bit of willingness to challenge the status quo to bring justice to the community.
Okay, I hear what you're saying, and I've read every word of the task force report, every word of Professor Friedman's, statement, appendix, Mr. Lazarus's, analysis, et cetera, et cetera. We all, I'm sure, have. It's been a lot of information to digest. It doesn't mean all my questions have been answered. Well, we've also gotten legal advice. So taking all of that into consideration, absorbing it all, doing our due diligence, and that's where I'm coming from on this. So I would ask that you not make any assumptions about what we may or may not be willing to consider. That's all I'm saying, and I would just ask you that due consideration. And if I may, just quickly, I have served on council a number of years, served previously. I've served on council when I participated in many police chief searches, and there are various forms that process is taken. I know we're not here tonight to, take a deep dive into that, but I've seen some processes that have really been outstanding, where we had multiple committees, citizen committees, a police staff committee, on and on and on, where people got to interview the candidates. And I will also just add that we've had great leadership provided by Interim Chief Faunus, and I know you've all gotten to know him. He's attended your meetings and assisted you throughout. And we've received letters from some of the members of your committee, some former members of your committee, commending this gentleman and his team. So I also, so would like to just make, have that noted as well. Thanks.
Further discussion, further questions from council?
May I ask you a brief question? 10-second question?
This is all fairly fluid, but sure, go ahead.
Thank you, yeah. There's just been reference to some kind of memo or whatever from the city attorney that I'm not familiar with, and I'm supposing it's a memo from the city attorney to council, and I recognize that that's probably privileged, but I'm thinking that in the interest of transparency, it would
Absolutely.
we can get it.
Yes.
You will publicize it.
One of the things which I'm requesting, I will. I would think it would be highly, a couple things.
It's a 10-second question.
It's a 10-second question, but it's far from an answer. The short answer is there will be a public, I will be requesting a public document to address the city attorney's, concerns or observations or, recommendations with respect to.
You're saying a public document, which I gather is redacted.
No, I don't think it'll be redacted because it'll be a separate document.
As I understand the mayor, I've already done public documents on the legal concerns, and I will prepare a public document for those legal concerns.
But I gather there's something that you're telling the council that we can't hear. And I do appreciate there's privilege, but I'm just trying to figure out why you would insist on the privilege here to any extent.
We get legal advice memos from the city, not just Mr. Postma. This is been the way it's been handled by every, may I finish?
Yeah, sure, sorry, I'm sorry.
By every city attorney. So the many predecessors of Mr. Postma who have sat in that seat and performed this important function for the city. It's just, it's the way the city attorney's office operates. And these are, on legal matters, on personnel matters, we get various you name it, attorney-client privilege memos, and on occasion, as the mayor just indicated he would, and sorry, I'm just jumping in here, but we can request a public, translation that is an attorney-client privilege. But it's the nature of this business that we're in.
I understand, it's just...
It's not unique to this issue.
I understand that. I'm just having trouble trying to figure out what there is in discussing this policy question, these policy questions about the validity of the ordinance we've proposed, on which you would have to insist on confidentiality. I don't see it.
You misunderstand. The request from the council is to prepare a public document that outlines any remaining legal concerns. And as long as that is the will of the whole council, which I assume it is.
It's fair to infer.
I will do that, and it won't be surprising to you, because the issues that we've raised are out there. But really, no issue, and I think it will help the community in some ways. Things that we are dealing with the CBA, for example, because the relationship with the police department is so important, those are not lightly cast aside. And so that's for the council to decide, but the legal concerns will be out there. That's what I have to do with any ordinance. I will do it, and I think it will make plain what the issues are. There are issues, but I will tell everybody who's here that the end result and the goal, I think, will be achieved, because there are all sorts of ways to draft around problems, and so. But right now, the ordinance as it stands, there are issues that I still have concerns, but ultimately, my concerns are for the advice of the council, and in the end, they'll make the determination. I do not make that determination. They have the hard job of actually adopting something, and I will do that.
Further discussion? I guess I'd like to, I have some questions about where some of about the ordinance as proposed. I think I will leave those to another day. Some of them have been answered. I will say this: I want to thank, of course, members of the Human Rights Commission for having moved us in this direction with their initial thoughts on the community's relationship with the police department, their work in obtaining, their work and support in obtaining, external consultants to review police department, to provide, external review of our policies and procedures and the practices with respect to those policies. That has already, I think, achieved important goals in making sure that some of the things we do are best practices. Further, I'd like to say that I very much appreciate the work that was done by the task force. You were provided not as much guidance as you ought to have received as to what it is that I and council perhaps were looking for. I think in part that's just the exigencies of local government. I think it also is in part because, frankly, of a goal of not seeking to influence truly what it is that you are doing and what you are providing. Letting you come up with, in part, what it is that you believed would be necessary and proper in order to improve the relationship between members of the community, improve trust in members of the community and the Ann Arbor Police Department. This all, of course, occurs in an important national context and an important local context. You know, we live in a country, as was stated, you know, truthfully, that was, you know, founded on white supremacy. And in the course of that founding, you know, law enforcement has played a central role in the propagation of white supremacy. You know, we all suffer, you know, from, you know, well, you know, we've lived in America, and to live in America, to grow up in America, as I have, and as many of us here have, means that we are, that we hold unintended biases and biases that that denigrate us, and it is, you know, it is our task to fight against it. I will also say that you know, other things are true. You know, I think it is true that if you stack up the Ann Arbor Police Department against other police departments throughout the country, you will find the police department that is filled with people who are disciplined, people who are professionals, and people who take their task with extreme earnestness, extreme seriousness, and do an outstanding job. Law enforcement officers come to the profession, I believe, for the right reasons. I believe law enforcement officers wake up every day for the purpose of coming to do their job, preserving the peace, protecting the public, and then you know, going home at night. There is that tension always between doing that job and their the views that other people's have of law enforcement officers, and that's a difficult one, and it's one that it is in part the purpose of this commission to address and improve. You know, we in Ann Arbor, we have a set of values, and we have, I think, a set of, you know, I'll use the word aspirations, even though it's been, I think, you know, well, we have a set of values and we have a set of aspirations. And when this commission is stood up, when it takes its role as a, you know, I believe, as it should, an intermediary between the police department and the public, a place where the police can come and learn how the public is perceiving them, learn about, you know, best practices, and a place where the public can frankly learn about the exigencies of law enforcement, which is an extremely difficult task and job, and one which requires you know, it asks of people to do things that many of us, I certainly, you know, would be incapable to do. And I think we all have to recognize as we move this forward that that there is both humanity in the officer and humanity in the other. Now, I also, you know, want to acknowledge that there are power differentials, and those power differentials have to be engaged and recognized as seen and seen for the and seen for what they are, and opposed as we can. And by naming them, I think we do it. The document that gets passed here at council, whether it's an ordinance, whether it's a resolution, it will be far from perfect. The people who staff the policing commission will have an incredibly difficult job. They will need to be, educated as the commission, as the task force has identified. They'll need to be educated with respect to, to bias and all manner of things with respect to privilege and power. They'll also need to be educated with respect to what it means to be a police officer, because ultimately we're asking police officers to do their job in a way that, in a way that reflects the community, in a way that makes the community proud. And a commission can't advise, can't recommend if it doesn't have that base of knowledge. So it'll be a balancing act. It'll be a balancing act that will be a project for this council, for subsequent councils, and for councils for years to come. Further discussion? We now come to public comment general time. So that you all know, public comment general time is an opportunity for folks to come and speak to us at council, to speak to the community as a whole. Speakers, as you come up, you'll have 3 minutes in which to speak. I think we're going to need to stick pretty close with that. There'll be a timer there. Please pay close attention to the time clock. As a matter of courtesy, we ask that we only have one person speaking at a time. And if you need assistance in speaking before council, speaking at public comment, we'd be delighted to provide it to you. If there are lots of people who wish to speak, as I expect there will be, I guess, because time is short, I'd ask you to queue up somewhere so that there's not that dead time in between. But that's merely a recommendation or advice. That's, of course, not an obligation. Is there anyone who'd like to speak at public comment?
Mr. Mayor, out of just respect to the people who are speaking, could I request that we just take like a 2-minute recess, timeout? I just don't want to get up and look as if I'm disrespecting people who are speaking just because we've been sitting for over 3 hours at the table.
All right, let's take a 5-minute break.
It's out of respect to the speakers.
Well, I think we're all tired,
I think the point, ma'am, is that you've had an opportunity to go to the bathroom and we haven't.
Short, so we
Thank
can
you.
finish. Yeah.
After a short break for public comment. Thank you very much. Please.
My name is Paquetta Palmer, and I live in Ann Arbor, and I'm registered to vote here. This has been one of the most painful but illuminating experiences I've had going to a public meeting. There were so many difficult things that you probably will never hear about that happened during those task force meetings, but I can tell you that these people really worked their bums off. They did an excellent job. They did it in the heat of the summer. They did it on their days off, on the weekends. They really put a lot of time and thought into this process. And early on, you would hear Ora Rosser quite a bit. You haven't heard that lately. But she's one of the reasons that this was so important to us. We know for a fact, for one thing, I want to bring up to you a thing called mandatory reporting. When you see certain abuses of vulnerable adults or children, certain people are mandatory reporters, like I am, because I work at mental health. And I just want you to know that anybody who's in a school, a cop, anybody like that, when you see somebody who's vulnerable or a child being abused, it is mandatory, just so you know. So if it's a Jerry, whatever that guy's name, whatever situation where someone's being abused, it's mandatory to report it. So that needs to be put in this somewhere so that it's explained that it's not, you know, if they find out something where there's a crime being committed against a vulnerable person, that would have to be reported. The other thing I want to say is, in the context of what you said, Mayor, it is a national situation. Ann Arbor is not in a bubble. Something is going to happen again. And for you to fail to take this important work forward in a meaningful way would mean that you do want to maintain the status quo. And I really hope that's not the case. We need a real way to address grievances because people have not been treated right, and we all know that. To ignore it means it's going to continue. To have a commission with no clout means it's going to continue and probably be worse when the next incident happens. I hope you take this opportunity to move us forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Jeff Harold. I pastor New Beginnings Community Church of Washtenaw County, and I'm a member of the Washtenaw Regional Organizing Coalition, and I live at 1393 King George Boulevard in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and the most beautiful woman in the world, my wife, is sitting right here. I just had to do that. It's okay. Just had to get it out there. So I'm just here to say I think that this commission has done a huge task in putting this together. As I sat there listening, I read through the documents, I read through what they presented, I read through the resolution that the city administrator brought out. And what I kept feeling was passive resistance to this report. In my line of work, ministry, if we're having a meeting and somebody says, let's pray about it, that means we're going to table this thing, okay? And we ain't never going to do anybody going to pray or do anything. It's just a nice, polite way to move it to the side. Just a couple of things. The reason you need a police review board, there are lethal things that happen. There are constant civil liberty violations that happen daily. And it's those things that really people need a place to come and bring their complaints and have them investigated. Back to my own profession, if anything, the church has shown you through the whole clergy sex abuse that you cannot count on one entity to police themselves. Somebody from the outside needs to have the authority to do the investigations that are needed. And in that sense, I know we have great, wonderful, fine police officers, but I would just put out there to venture. There may be some police officer that may be looking at the quote-unquote few bad apples and saying, please give us some entity that can break this blue wall so that I don't have to put my own career and go against my training officer or my partner to talk about things that may be happening. Now, again, I'm not talking about the violent things, and we know they happen, like getting shot sitting in your own apartment when a police officer comes into the wrong door. But I'm talking about the decency issues, the abuse of authority that can come on a daily basis. And the reason that you need this is so that there can be confidence in the citizenry. If Ann Arbor thinks that when citizens see the police and they hear about what happens in Baltimore or Baton Rouge or wherever, they don't see that happening here, they are fooling themselves. And as I said before, you don't know if you're going to get Andy Taylor or Bull Connor when the police comes to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Leslie Stambaugh, and I'm chair of the Ann Arbor Human Rights Commission. I know this process is in its earlier stages, and that there's going to be a lot of discussion and a lot of praying. But the Human Rights Commission met last night and discussed what we think are the most critical differences between the task force proposal and the resolution that was sent. And we want you to know that we don't think they're interchangeable. We've talked about what we thought were the main issues, and I want to give you our reading on them so far. First, about membership. In order to create a policing commission that's positioned to have the trust of the community, it's essential that the council require clearly described broad recruiting effort in order to ensure the strong, diverse pool of applicants. The task force recommended that the HRC assist with both the recruitment and the selection of applicants. We've been honing our tools and experience to effectively reach out to our community, and the HRC is dedicated to doing that. So if asked to help, the HRC would in fact prepare a plan and share it with you to recruit candidates, vet them, and provide the mayor with a top choice pool from which to draw nominations. We know from experience that this process is very labor intensive, it's very difficult, but the HRC has agreed unanimously last night that the effort is well worth it, and we would be willing to undertake it. Second, access to information. The resolution should include, if the resolution is what is passed, a clear, unequivocal statement by council that AAPD shall give the commission the information it requests unless it's prohibited by law or bargaining agreement. This is crucial to credibility and ultimate success of any policing commission. All the commissions will tell you that. Third, council and funding. The HRC also unanimously supported the task force's recommendation for independent counsel and funding. The proposed resolution appears to give the police chief an inappropriate role, we thought, in determining the commission funding. Fourth, confidentiality. The policing commission needs to be able to hear from people who do not wish their concerns to be shared with police. We understand that. The city administrator's resolution requires that every complaint be sent directly to the police, even though it's not clear that collective bargaining agreements necessarily require it, and we don't think unnecessary barriers should put into place. Finally, I want you to know we had disagreements about whether police should be members.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Shirley Beckley, and I live in Pittsfield Township and have been a member of this community 76 years. I have a question for you, Mayor Taylor. I'm wondering, since there's a lot of questions I have, but this is about the budgeting. So I'm wondering, since that millage passed with that money that was divided some kind of way between the city and the county, and I'm wondering if we can tap into that money so we can have a bigger budget. And in it, because that money is there for mental health issues and other issues. And that's how we got here, because Ms. Rosser was a mental health patient. So we want to make sure that when people come in, and the other thing I want to explain to you is, it isn't that people are just going to come with all these complaints. It's kind of a, at least in my mind, what I thought we were asking for is if they've gone and made complaints, or they've gone through the court system and they didn't get any justice that they thought they ought to have, then they can come to the commission, who can further help them to get the justice that we have been trying to get for so many years. So it's not just something to just go into the police and tell them that they're bad. We know they're not all bad. But some of them don't even know that they're racist, and they are. So I'm not going to say that they do it intentionally all the time, but it happens. And so if they're not aware of their privilege and their racism, we have to have some kind of way to help them to understand that. So it's not just to attack them, it's to help them. And in helping them through this commission, that's how we're going to build our trust, so that we can trust you, the council, and the police, and anybody else that's in government. That's how we build the trust, to work together. So that's all we're asking. So since money is part of the problem, I'd like to ask if you would consider tapping into the money that you all were given. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lainey Katz, and I live in Ann Arbor. I just want to make 2 quick points. I think it's very important because everybody is comparing cities to cities. We cannot compare ourselves to Berkeley, California, or to some other city out west. We're Ann Arbor, and we have our own problems. We're an offshoot of Detroit, which is a city built on hate, led by Henry Ford. So I don't think it serves a purpose to compare ourselves to other cities. Ann Arbor has its own problems. It has a history of racism. We're living it right now. That we're even discussing this now, I find appalling. That's my first point. My second point is, I already forgot my second point. I'm so tired. I guess for you to say, and I don't mean any disrespect, to say that Ann Arbor, all the good things about Ann Arbor, the police, and at least they're not as bad as, I don't think that's helpful. It doesn't help to compare, because we can compare the Nazis to another group of people. They haven't killed us. It's not that bad. So I don't think that's a helpful point to say Ann Arbor's not that bad. And actually, you're not living the life of some of the people that have. So I don't think it's really fair to say that.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Judy Bonnell-Wenzel. I live at Brayburn Circle, which is a townhouse cooperative of more than 600 units. As far as I'm concerned, I am privileged to live in a very, very diverse neighborhood. I grew up with pure apartheid on the Gulf Coast in Port Arthur, Texas. And I realized, even though I finally was able to meet somebody who was African American, who was my age when I got to Ann Arbor, I have been privileged to go to Washtenaw Community College. Because I'm over 65, I get to go free. I know that not everybody here who's white might get to go free there, but you might have enough money to pay because it's not a very expensive school. African American history is taught there by a man who's African American who grew up in Detroit. The history of Africa is taught there usually. It's an eye-opener, and it helps. It helps people who are white to find out, wow, the first person who died in the Revolutionary War was actually a black man, an African American. And the person who invented stoplights was actually an African American. And pretty soon you start to realize, wow, people who are African American are smart. They have made great contributions to our country, not just as slaves, but you know, the person who set up how Washington D.C. is set up was an African American. You know, so just get a little more informed. Take that class. It's a wonderful class, and read Michelle Alexander's book and so on. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Adam Nash. I'm a resident of Water Hill. Mayor Taylor, in your closing comments, you commented lamenting that the task force didn't receive enough guidance about what you and City Council were looking for. I'm glad that the proposal doesn't reflect what you were looking for. It reflects what the people are looking for, and it's your job to implement that.
Thank you.
My name is Chidima Ozor, and I was born and raised here in Ann Arbor and have been back for about 2 years, and I lived in Las Vegas for 10 years. So my heart is racing because this is really important. And so my encouragement to you all, I was just observing, is to set aside what you think you know so that you can have a new experience. Humility and awareness is a big thing, and that is something that I didn't really feel throughout the exchange, so that's something that you may want to consider. My dad, this is hard to say, so he was diagnosed with Parkinson's 4 years ago, and as I would see on the news the number of unarmed black men shot and killed for doing what people do, I thought about my dad. He has tremors. That is not him reaching for anything. That is simply the way that his body is right now. Now, I will say something that may not be popular in this crowd, but it's something that I feel compelled to say. To the police officers that are in this room and those beyond, I do thank you for your service. That said, I want you to interact with the community that you've been tasked to serve and protect in a way that's meaningful and respectful and honorable, because that is what you signed up to do. I'm not a police officer because that's not what I feel called to do, but that's what you feel called to do, and so you have a responsibility, a greater responsibility. The next thing that I do want to say, and then I'll wrap it up, is simply that these conversations need to remain open. It's all about the conversation. My business is called the Type A Hippie, and I'm very Type A and I'm very hippie. I'm all about essential oils, love, and light. However, that's not all there is. Sometimes we have to have these hard conversations, and we have to be really honest with ourselves. There are a lot of buzzwords that are happening. Google is available. A lot of resources are available. It's important that I'm not going to educate those of you that don't have the same skin color as me. That's not my responsibility. I'm not your teacher. You get to own this, and you get to be a part of the solution. And so that's my encouragement to all of us. I mean, everyone can learn something about something, but we have to do the work, and it cannot just be empty words and promises. It has to be real and meaningful, because that is how you build trust. That is how you build relationship.
Thank you.
My name is Charmin Spicer. Some of you know me because I was active in the search for the last police chief. I want to say loudly and clearly that you do not need a commission to select the next police chief, that you are able to find a search firm that can address all the values that you've articulated that you want in a commission. There have been very effective searches conducted in this city for superintendents, as Jane said, for police chiefs, where a commission wasn't involved. So I would really encourage the whole council to separate those two tasks and to utilize the experience of the task force and the learning that the task force members have all been through, and utilize that as well as the expertise of a search firm that can reflect your values. My understanding is that an RFP has already gone out to find a search firm. Maybe you could pull that back in or make an extra effort to find some firms that will reflect the values of equity and social justice, and go in that direction, and in the meantime, take all the time you need to establish an effective commission.
Thank you.
Anna Gersh, I'm a member of the task force. It sounds to me like it may actually be the best thing to go ahead and pass the ordinance as is. There will be many opportunities to refine and revise the ordinance along the way. If it is the case that we have a strong police force, then you should feel safe to pass a comprehensive ordinance such as we've written. The fact that there are so many different ways to approach police oversight suggests there's an opportunity to take the best of these opportunities and create something totally new and comprehensive. This is an opportunity for Ann Arbor to set a high bar and be a model nationwide. Also, it may be that passing such a comprehensive ordinance may be the best way to recruit a really forward-thinking and progressive police chief that will internally implement the kinds of training that will create a real and lasting culture change of the sort most in the community would desire.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm a commissioner and vice chair of the Human Rights Commission, one of 3 involved in the subcommittee to select members for the task force. I also attended several of the task force meetings, went on a ride-along with the AAPD, and attended a small informational session conducted by Deputy Police Chief Forsberg. I offer this information to give some context for my full support of the task force draft ordinance as written. The city administrator's resolution doesn't seek to clarify, it seeks to replace. It seeks to create something different that lacks specifics. If good, strong, solid language is what the city council is looking for, I suggest that you propose modifications to the task force draft ordinance instead and use that as a starting point. For an example, I know the city administrator noted that trespass and that modifications to trespass were were something that happened as a result of the task force being convened. I do not mean to minimize any of the work that the task force has done, just to clarify that these conversations started last fall after the Blake Transit Center incident happened, before the task force was ever convened. To say that the work that came out of those discussions we began last fall was a direct consequence of the task force is to rewrite the timeline and shift focus from the reason that the task force was created in the first place. Trespass, however, is a good example of why we need a truly independent police oversight commission. Then Police Chief Baird informed the HRC that the feedback he had received about the incident had been positive, and that they had described the officer's conduct as gentle. When the chief stated that the officer's conduct had been fully compliant with department policy, we were told what policy that was complied with, but weren't given the details of the policy, and we still haven't been given that information. This, in my mind, is a perfect illustration of why an independent police oversight commission is necessary in the first place. Moreover, I think that if anything useful is to be taken from the Hilliard Hines report, it is the fact that one of the major problems in our community is that there is a lack of trust, that there is a lack of belief that there's transparency in the system. If that's the case, I ask that you consider whether discarding the task force draft ordinance, which is the result of a transparent public process, contributes to that fear or not. I think one of the huge differences I see between what the task force has produced and what Hilliard Hines has produced is that this process has been public. It has members of the public have come out and shared their thoughts. the Hillary Hines, when I asked whether or not they were truly interviewing a diverse subsection of the community, they asked me if I had any Asian friends that would want to speak to them. That was the extent that they were willing to really look at a diverse subsection of the community. When I was at the last work session with City Council and we were questioning Hillary Hines, I asked why they had not interviewed a single person who had been incarcerated or arrested, and they said that that was not important. And that was not, and they said that that was not important, but that has still been the starting point of the city. I've never heard the city display anything but ownership and respect of the Hillary Hines report, despite all the criticisms that have been assessed against it.
Thank you.
I asked that City Council display that sort of ownership over the task force draft ordinance, and I had the same respect for the task force.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Stephanie Hamilton. I'm part of a small business in Ann Arbor. I live on the north side and I vote. I'm not worried about the budget. The proposed budget of $300,000 is 1.17% of the police budget, I believe. And if hundreds of community members can put hours and hours and hours on weekends, on evenings, on holidays, during work trying to answer emails, to do all the processes that started not just 4 months ago, but in 2015, before that in 2014, before that in the 90s, before that in the 70s. We bring all this time, the police can find 1.17% of their budget to support community engagement for trust. That's not something I'm worried about. I'm also not worried about it because Officer David Reed is still on the payroll for $99,000 a year. I'm not worried about taking a little longer to make sure that everybody on the council has a chance to digest all of the ordinance. I was very confused about hearing from Mr. Lazarus that we want to speed up to build trust when everyone in this room and hundreds of people outside of this room are saying that the resolution will destroy trust as proposed. That to build trust, we move forward with the work that comes out of, again, hours and hours and hours of citizen work. And to think about that, I want us to take 10 seconds to think about, why are we here? Are you here to wait until we stop talking? Why are we here? This room is a front line for democracy. I don't want to be in a city council meeting that reminds me of a Senate Judiciary Committee meeting where elected officials say that they got our consent at the ballot box, and now they're going to use the power of their positions and the power of procedure to do what they think is best for us. Our consent didn't end with the ballot. Our consent has continued over years with the marching, with community discussions. I only know a handful of people here. I've been in probably 5 or 6 different church basements, synagogues, in community meetings. I've listened to Chief Baird talk for an hour, plus more. I've listened. We've done so much work. And I want you all as representatives to use the power of your positions and procedure for democracy, not for autocracy. I want you to use it to uplift what actual democracy is, where we all meet each other and tell our stories, and all the different people from this committee, from the task force, put all those stories together. And that is a chorus of democracy, and you all can lift it up. So please, lift it up. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak at public comment?
Good evening. I'm Paul Saginaw. I've been an Ann Arbor resident since 1971, and I'm a co-founder of Zingerman's Community of Businesses, and I would like you to know that I have a lot of coworkers that come to work very early in the morning. They get off their shifts very early in the morning. They're often late for work because they're driving while black. So we don't have a perfect city here. And one other thing I'd like to address funding. You know, civilian oversight of police enforcement takes many forms. You know, it goes from bodies that are the status quo to Oakland, California, where they can remove a police chief. But there's some common elements of very effective ones. And one of those elements is that they are well funded. And I would ask, when you're going to make your decisions, that you don't look at it as an expense, but an investment. Okay, because if there is some decision, if there is some recommendation that comes from that commission that results in a lawsuit that doesn't happen, it's money well spent. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak at public comment? Anyone else? Seeing no one, public comment is closed. May I have a motion to adjourn, please? Moved by Councilmember Westfall, second by Councilmember Grand. Discussion. All in favor? Opposed? We are adjourned.